roll call. Jean?
Here.
Ann?
Here.
Steve?
Here.
Larry?
Here.
Eric?
Here.
Stacy?
Here.
The gang is all here. Notice of meeting.
The meeting was properly noticed.
I need a motion to adopt the agenda.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor signal by saying aye.
Aye.
Before we proceed to the Pledge of Allegiance, I'd like to have, on behalf of the board, extend our support and condolences to the victims of the tragic and senseless incident that of violence that took place last evening at the annual Waukesha Holiday Parade. I would ask everyone to please join the board in a moment of silence to honor the victims and the support of their families. Thank you. Now, if you would stand and join me in saying the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. First up on the agenda tonight is Spotlight on Learning, and we have Asa Clark Middle School with us tonight.
All right, Anthony, if you want to take it from here.
Yeah, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, so I just want to introduce Aaron Muntic, who is an 8th grade math teacher at Asa Clark Middle School. And one of the things that we've worked very hard at the middle school is to infuse the graduate profile competencies into learning activities for students. So I want to specifically highlight the work that Aaron has done with some students, specifically at creating some partnerships with community businesses and also creating authentic learning opportunities for our students. So Aaron, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, AJ. Or no, Anthony. So yeah, I'm Erin Mente. I teach 8th grade math here at ASA. This is my second year doing 8th grade. Previously, I was 7th grade. So this kind of all came from, I started 8th grade last year, and it was kind of a wild year to start anyways, but kind of went for it. And we run our dilations unit, and I was just looking for an experience for the students to participate in that had like an authentic community. We really wanted something that the students would produce and there was actually like going somewhere. So I reached out to Tim O'Brien. They were kind enough to let us use their blueprints. So we used their blueprints, and the students will kind of talk to you about it a little bit more. But we used their blueprints, we dilated their blueprints, we created scaled images of them, and then students used the laser engraver, and they were able to either laser them on wood or acrylic. And then those did go out into the community. They're at some of the model homes from Tim O'Brien Homes and some of their offices. So that's kind of a little bit about us. And then I have a couple students with me, if you guys want to stand. And then, so we have Brooke, Lily, Annabelle, AJ, and then Brady, if you guys want to come forward. So let me change this here. There we go. So this was our overall project goal. So students were in groups, and they worked in those groups to calculate the scaled measurements. We did this after our dilations unit. So students learned how to do dilations, learned what scale factor was, learned how to enlarge things, reduce things, and this was kind of like the end product of it. So they created the scale drawings, put their measurements into SketchUp, and then they were using the laser engraver.
To start the project, we were on a Google Meet with Jenny Flathammer and Mark Cullen from Tim O'Brien's company, and they kind of talked about the processes of creating blueprints and plans and the roles and responsibilities that the company has to create them. They also talked about the steps and like things to do if you want to get into this kind of career path, different courses, degree requirements, and kind of extracurricular activities to take to prepare. And then we also did a scavenger hunt on their website to learn more about their core values, techniques, and ways they provide back to the community through partnering with schools and doing different foundations. And we also found out more about the processes that they use to build homes and meeting with clients and providing to the community.
After that, we got a blueprint from Tim O'Brien of one of their homes, and we measured the lengths of certain walls based off line numbers from the color-coded table, and then we multiplied it by a scale factor of 2.25.
You can kind of see so the sheet the students had is the one kind of on the right side there. So they worked on that as a group. And then for each of the different blueprints, I kind of color coded the walls as like the important walls because there's tons of walls on them. So just kind of identify some for them. So kind of they numbered them. They would like measure line 1, then calculate line 1, move on to line 2 of the group and that sort of thing. So each of the different houses had the different color coding just to guide the students. And then if they finished early, they could go back in and add in extra lines if they had to. But we really wanted for sure the color coded lines in there.
Then we took the measurements and we kind of like split up the jobs, and while someone was drawing the lines, other people were telling them how long to make the lines and where to put the lines, and so we ended up with this.
You guys want to even take a look and pass it around if you want.
So it's a drawing on graph paper of all of the measurements and the blueprints, and the rooms are labeled with the doors.
So that's kind of like their first enlargement. So they had the smaller size paper blueprints from Tim O'Brien, and that's their enlarged blueprint on paper of the 2-in-1 floor.
These are some pictures from last year of the students drawing the blueprints and what their final products were.
Yeah, so you can kind of see like the one on the left, that's the blueprint from Tim O'Brien, and then there's the scaled up student versions that correspond with it. So it's first floor and second floor.
Then Mr. Lamp made videos so that we could learn how to use SketchUp and get familiar with the website. We then used the scaled up measurements that we wrote down on the paper and from the blueprint and put them into SketchUp. Once everyone in your group knew how to use SketchUp, you would take the measurements and put them in. If you had a 2-story home, you would split your group in half, and you would have 2 people working on the first floor and 2 people working on the second floor. And then once you were done with your SketchUp, the ones in the green are from SketchUp. And then once you were done with your SketchUp drawing, you would import them to Google Drawing, and then from there you would then label the rooms. Then after you were done labeling, you would send the Google Drawing to Mr. Lamp, and he would then print them on acrylic or on wood.
And then after Thanksgiving, we're gonna give our laser designed acrylic or wood pieces to Tim O'Brien Homes, and then they're gonna put them in their like offices or like model homes to show to customers. And then like the pictures are from last year, but some students that gave theirs to Tim O'Brien.
Yeah, so the one on the left side, that's right at, in their Pewaukee office actually, right behind the secretary's main desk is that one right there. And then there's a couple other, like the one on the right side, those are in their actual model homes. They're kind of staged all over the place there.
And then after we were done lasering them and they were all printed, we reflected on everything that we've learned about the design thinking process, about how like we work together in groups, and just about how we learned the important design thinking processes. And then we also reflected on the graduate profile and how the competencies connected to this project and how we learned to connect and give back to the community.
And so every student would fill this out, and then kind of, you just scroll down. So you can kind of see, just talking about like the design thinking process, how well do you think you learned the design thinking process? Could you teach it to someone? Kind of just reflective questions on the whole process itself. And then connecting it to the graduate profile. So like, what core competencies did your group meet? What ones did you really excel in? Which are some ones that your group can kind of work in within still?
After this, probably after Thanksgiving break, we're gonna do a gallery walk, where we'll take all the papers and the SketchUp stuff and the scaled up model of the blueprint and the laser printed copy, and we'll show it to other students, and we'll get to see what other people did with the blueprint and reflect on what we could have done differently.
Yeah, so these are pictures from last year when we did our gallery walk. So students have their final product, they have their like packet of their measurements, they have their scaled up drawing on the graph paper, and it's kind of cool for like, cause there's 7 different types of houses, and so each of the classrooms did one set. So like the Kendall home happened in 3 of our classrooms, so it's kind of cool for them to see like the similarities between that should be in theory the same, but sometimes there are differences, of course. So like what was the same between the different house styles and whatnot, and kind of what were the differences, and just kind of see the complexity that went into it. And then we did bring we have final products from these guys actually they made.
Alright.
If you guys want to pass them around, that'd be wonderful. Let me start the one over there. And so these were from the 2 groups from this year.
Fantastic. Now, are you actually gonna get a field trip to see the actual house built?
That would be wonderful. Yeah, we did show them at the start some of the different, there's like high school programs that do kind of connect with Tim O'Brien homes. So we did show them the Holly home is one of the homes we do, and the Holly home was built by a group of high school students last year. So we did show them that little news article. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Other board members have questions?
Yeah, do you guys have any questions?
I do. What was the most challenging part of this project? And how'd you overcome it?
Correct.
I would say learning how to use SketchUp.
Okay.
Yeah. It was like, there's a learning curve to SketchUp, so they have the measurements, but getting it to actually go into the computer program and have the line go the right direction and connect to the other lines, that seemed to be kind of a struggle. Any other struggles?
Part of our like thing was flipped on the blueprint and then on
The color coding?
code sheet. So then it was kind of difficult to flip it on the actual thing.
Yeah, they made like adjustments to the blueprint, like after we printed them and color coded them. So there were slight adjustments they had to kind of problem solve around.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Larry?
Good question. And again, I'm really not very expert in any of the design building of a home, but were there any kind of design principles, or when they're actually sitting down and potentially designing a home, where do they start? What are their first conversations with the design and building of a home?
Yeah. Do you guys want to? So when they, Jetty Flanhammer from Tim O'Brien talked to us, and she actually brought in the person who's kind of in charge of their blueprints, and he showed us kind of a picture of it and it was just like a sketch, like a quick sketch he made, just on a sheet of paper, and then he kind of transformed it by then put it into the computer, and it kind of evolves then from there. Yeah, but it was just like a sketch, almost like on just a kind of a scrap piece of paper, and he kind of built it from there.
And maybe I should lead you on with my question, but
Yeah.
so if you're designing and building something, there's an end user in mind in terms of what's there. I mean, so the size of family, size of spaces. I mean, did they talk at all about that as any part of the design thinking or design principles?
Yeah, they kind of created like flex rooms, so people could create it an office for it. They could create it into like a playroom. So they do have that in mind, and they talk about it like when they're designing different things too, like picking the different colors of things, kind of what's popular now, but what's also not going to go out of style within a very short amount of time. So they kind of keep that into consideration. Yeah.
Steve?
I'd like to hear from one of the students, what was most surprising? What was most surprising about doing this project? Something you didn't think would happen or you didn't think you would learn about, and you did?
Probably like how many really small walls there are in a house.
That's good, that's great. Little details matter, right?
No more surprises.
So would you buy the house? Anybody buy the house that you designed, or where they were designing?
Brooke would buy it.
Yeah. They're all quite beautiful.
Maybe for your birthday next year.
Yeah, right.
I'll ask one more. Aaron, what did you learn from the project in the way that you'll deploy this or similar types of things for your students next year?
Yeah, so my first year doing this was last year, and this was so I felt way more comfortable this year doing it. Last year was like definitely the learning curve, and there was 2 groups doing it, so a group would work on it in person, and then the next group that was in person would continue to work on it, so it did take a lot longer last year as well. But kind of this year for next year, I guess. Sketchup does seem to be the struggle with it all, just because there is a slight learning curve with it. I'm not super familiar with it either, so thank goodness for Mr. Lamb. He comes in and helps support us kind of just launching it off, but kind of learning maybe a little bit more about Sketchup next year. They did a really nice job though finishing up our dilations unit with it. It kind of was a seamless transition into it. So they did a really nice job working with it, calculating with it, and that sort of thing.
So one of the, and this is for Aaron probably more so too. So what does Tim O'Brien get out of this? What's their return or value for them?
So Tim O'Brien, he likes making community connections. He works with multiple high schools around the area. And so he likes kind of just getting kids interested in maybe the design piece of it or the trades piece of it. We showed kids like the different, it was like a time-lapse video of a house being built, all the way from like them digging out the basement to building like the studs out to, doing the siding and then the interior stuff as well. So I think he gets out of it just kids' exposure to the industry, exposure to like there's multiple pieces that go into building a home. It's not just the construction piece, but it's the ordering the materials piece. It's the reading, the writing. We had him and Jenny kind of talk about the different reading and writing and math pieces, like when are they being used actually. So they were able to kind of expand on that.
Anything else?
I guess my question for the students is, so really you were kind of tricked into learning some math by designing a house. So just curious as to how you so the idea, right, is that you don't just learn math in isolation, you learn what to do with some math. So anybody have any comments about your enjoyment or your preference or how this may have helped you learn your math? Yeah, then they can hear you on the live stream, but.
I thought it was a more fun way of doing math and a good way to kind of like wrap up our unit.
Great, thanks. Anybody else? Yeah, come on.
So I really enjoyed it because it was just a different, more like hands-on experience to kind of learn it, and it was also nice to like see how things we're learning in school can also apply to further careers and potential things that we do in life in the future.
You guys did a great job. Thank you.
Thank you.
Don't leave without your parting gifts. Brooke, I think that's a key to your new house. Oh, yeah.
Thanks for coming in, Aaron.
Yep, thank you, man.
Thanks for coming. Next up, I'm going to turn over to Dr. Katie for the update. You had 2 emails go out. If everybody saw the second one, hopefully there was a correction that he sent out. So I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. So, COVID update with a little bit of, I talked about at the last meeting, we've done some modification to protocols. Last meeting we really worked through consensus as we were trying to react to some increase in cases. So tonight, I have a little bit more structure to get your feedback and potential approval for some modifications to the plan. So you have the plan that's basically just an edited version of what you approved in August for our operational plan for the year. We've learned a lot, and this is now week 13. We're wrapping up here in the school year. Hard to believe it's went that fast. And so we've learned lots of things, and as we've tried to manage through cases and what it looks like differently in our different schools. And so I want to give you some rationale for some of the changes to the plan, which were largely reflected in the last 2 weeks of updates that went out to families. So plan revision recommendations. Really what's the purpose of these recommendations is to provide flexibility for the mitigation protocols so that we may apply those in a more strategic and targeted manner. So that's one component or purpose of the updates. Continue to create, I'm going to actually pull this up on my screen so I can read it better without turning around. I know Danielle's got the new super-powered contact. She can maybe read it across. But
Read finally.
So continue to find creative ways. This is something we've been focused on this year, as it's like COVID 2.0, and we're trying to figure out how to operate schools and to really be thoughtful about how we can maybe find creative ways to empower parental choice wherever it's feasible and still maintain the safety in our school environment. So that's a component of this. We always want to maximize that in-person student attendance. So for example, last spring, with the support of Waukesha County Health Department, we did some changes to our quarantine procedures that helped us keep a lot more kids in-person student attendance. The modifications I'm recommending for your consideration with the flexibility would continue to allow us to apply certain approaches to fewer numbers of students, which can help us keep more students in-person attendance if we have spikes in cases. And of course, keep students and staff as safe and as healthy as possible using layered mitigation strategies. And that's really what the CDC recommends, is that you layer your mitigation strategies. There's lots of recommendations, but that's kind of at the core, that to minimize the spread of COVID-19, that you really need to have multiple kinds of strategies and approaches. So, a quick summary of the plan revision. So as we moved to level orange, so 2 weeks ago we went to orange and we implemented some modified approaches. We moved away from a language that really required what we would call a test to stay strategy. So what that means is with contact tracing and quarantine, at orange it was stated as required that any non-symptomatic close contact would be required to provide submit a negative test, or would have to complete a full quarantine of a minimum of 10 days. We changed that language from required to strongly encourage, so that we didn't have to implement that required testing piece at that level. Part of the reason also for some of these changes is we were, from a timing standpoint, we were really right up against these breaks, and we wanted to see, is this a real trend? Because we had a 4-week consecutive trend of cases coming down, and then we had a little bit of then we started to jump back up. Was that going to be a blip, or was that going to be a trend? And now it looks more like a trend, that we're having multiple weeks of rising cases. So we wanted to kind of wait before implementing those. But moving that language from really a requirement to really encourage it. We've had some success with families and a lot of success with staff of more voluntary participation in testing, and that's been helpful. We moved to the implementation of recommended screening testing for groups experiencing higher growing cases. So what does that mean? As a strategy where we have a grade level or a classroom or a house that may have increasing cases, that we really recommend to parents of that group of students to participate in screening testing. Again, of course, it would be their option. What I mean by screening testing is that these are students who are just in a population. They aren't necessarily found to be directly exposed through contact tracing. So for example, we offered that in PLE to a classroom, and we had 15 parents volunteer to have their kids tested. I believe we found 1 or 2 positives in that group. And through that process, we were able to reduce spread because we identified some cases through voluntary compliance with or voluntary participation in that kind of a strategy. And required testing for all staff asymptomatic and those identified as close contacts. We removed a requirement for screening testing for staff. That was in place with the original plan. Original plan called for all unvaccinated staff to be required to participate in screening testing. Again, that was back in August, and we know more now than we did then. For example, we estimate we're somewhere between 85 and 90% vaccinated as a staff. We generally have very low numbers of cases among our staff. And from a voluntary perspective, they participate whenever they have symptoms or exposure. We've had great compliance with our staff. So we did not feel there was going to be a lot of return on investment for imposing that kind of a strategy. And I think our staff appreciates it more when they have some voice and choice in the matter versus being required to do those kinds of things. We don't think it provides additional risk for us considering the high level of vaccination and the cooperation that we've had. So those are kind of the changes at orange that are suggested. Level red, which is where we hit for the first time last week. We currently are today still in level red. So the language there is moved from a required test to stay strategy to may require approach, targeted at groups experiencing high and or growing rates. So let me explain what I mean there. So as opposed to implementing K-12, a strategy that would require large numbers of students to be tested on a daily basis or to be serving a quarantine procedure if they chose not to be tested. This would be used more as a targeted strategy. So to kind of illustrate, the last month plus, we've had relatively consistently low cases at Pewaukee High School. We generally have less than 4 or 5 cases at the high school. I think currently we're at 3 maybe cases at Pewaukee High School. We've seen by far the most cases in our elementaries. So we know we were having a spike in 6th grade, for example. So if we were to use this strategy there, we could just implement a test to stay strategy maybe for a 2-week period, say in 6th grade, if that's where we're finding a cluster of cases. So this language allows us to be targeted with a strategy versus kind of this imposition of something that may be more objectionable to people. Do it for a limited period of time with a smaller group is the concept. Also in our level red that was previously approved is that masking would have been required for all students unless they had a waiver on file. And again, that language would move that to a strategy that we may use, kind of like I described with the testing. So if you had a group, a place where you have a spike going on, you may temporarily implement a masking requirement. Multiple districts around us have used this. Sussex, Menominee Falls, Oconomowoc are 3 that come to mind that they've used some strategic masking to try to offset spikes when they happen. So again, moving down from a required universal, to me it would make sense to, for example, implement a masking requirement at the high school if there's low cases because we're having a spike in cases, say in an elementary grade level.
Was that on a slide called level red? Or?
Oh, I'm sorry. I advanced on my screen here, and I forgot to advance on the screen here. There you go. Working off of 2 pieces of technology, forgot to advance. So this is what I've just described. So that move from required test to stay to that flexible may require approach. Same thing with masking, move from a required to a may require flexible approach for implementing testing with the note that strategies are intended to be implemented for a maximum of 2 weeks. That was by design, and that was at this board's direction because then you would always have the opportunity to review and weigh in as to whether we should continue with those approaches.
When you do the screening, the voluntary screening test, like you did it once, did you just do it one time?
That was a strategy we just used like a week or 2 ago for the first time.
And that was enough and you saw numbers go down? But if numbers stayed, you might do it again, or is that just case
Well,
by case?
I view it as a tool in the toolbox.
Okay.
So we were seeing increasing cases at a grade level at PLE. And so that was, I think it was maybe a classroom that was starting to see some cases, and so it was offered and really recommended as a strategy to the parents of those children to say, we have increasing cases. We would recommend doing some screening testing. We really want to kind of nip this before it continues, and this is a strategy that we can use. And again, looking for those creative, voluntary, parent choice kind of approaches. That was one that we used recently. Another example, and I think I compliment Pete, he was the first one to do this as we were spiking at Horizon. We have emergency remote learning, which is really intended for students who are placed in isolation or in quarantine. And it can be a challenge for teachers because now they're teaching in those two environments. But when we saw cases really spiking at Horizon, a strategy prior to really doing a required temporary virtual learning for the whole class was to offer parents the option of just putting their kids out and into emergency remote learning. And he'd have sections where half the class may choose that option, which does a couple of things. It takes kids out of the mix that could possibly spread or be infected, and it allows for greater social distancing within that classroom because now you're more spread out. So it has that kind of effect. So it's that intermediate step. Again, it provides some choice to parents. We're trying to work through this without having to impose virtual learning. Ultimately, in some of those environments that we went to virtual learning. Brian has done some similar things at PLE. Doesn't really work as an option at the high school, probably. But with the environments at PLE, that's an option. So whether it be the choice to participate in screening testing, it's a flexible option. We can say we're seeing kind of a spike here. Let's deploy this strategy where we're having an increase. And that's the philosophy behind some of these suggestions.
When we did the emergency virtual learning, were the teachers fully on board? Was there any challenge there?
I didn't hear any issues from teachers. It's easier for them to do one or the other versus doing both. So really the emergency remote, so the nuance there again is usually with emergency remote you have some here and some at home. The temporary virtual, they're all at home and you're doing fully virtual, or if they're all here, you're doing them. You're in one mode of instruction. So it's more manageable or easier to manage in that way. But I didn't hear any concerns from teachers, and we worked real hard to try to avoid being in those situations. We've had to do it twice. We did a 4th and a 5th grade section, right, Pete? And then we did the 6th grade. The 4th and 5th grade were out, I think, for 4 days because we had tied it to that 4-day weekend.
We had a group of 3rd and a group of 4th go out for 4 days, and we did another group a week after that.
Yeah. So we had 3 groups that did, and that's another goal that we've had with temporary virtual is try to affect as few students for the shortest time possible. So that was helpful because we could tie it to that 4-day weekend, and so we acted there. Asa Clark, we did the 6th grade, and we'd already had a virtual day coming up for conferences. So I believe the 6th grade was just out for a couple of days because we knew we had a good chunk of those students scheduled to come back from isolation that next Monday. So they were out that Wednesday, Thursday, Friday tied to a weekend. So now you got a 5-day gap to see if the cases kind of stopped accelerating, and it seemed to be effective when we've done those things. So those pauses and having the groups together, because it's definitely the case that this year we see more school spread than we saw last year with the Delta variant is much more active among school-age kids.
So I know you contacted us when the whole class went, but you're telling us that there was some that it was mixed, right? And how many days did that last?
Never longer than 4.
Okay.
Yeah, with the emergency remote.
Okay.
Yep. So again, that was just something that we've added to the mix. That is one of your highlighted changes in the master plan for you guys to look at as another strategy.
Questions, Steve?
I have a couple of questions. What are we seeing related to health outcomes versus the spike we had exactly at the same time last year? I mean, we're seeing the case rates in the population of our district spike up at the same time that it happened last year, maybe a week later than last year. But what are we seeing related to health outcomes? What's the county saying about that?
Yeah, I guess 2 things to note. One, so grand total of cases are still well below where they were November last year. However, school-age kids cases are much higher than they were last year. So by the end of October, we had had as many cases by the end of October this year as we had by the end of December last year.
Yeah.
So about 2 months ahead in terms of that piece. So two things: less in the community because this has been affecting school-age children more. And that's the statewide. It's that 0 to 18 kind of age group is having most of the cases, especially the younger kids. But from health outcomes, they've seen no increase in hospitalizations or severe disease from what we get reports when we meet with them weekly. I hear similar things from our children's hospital reports when we're on with their chief medical officer once a month, that they have there certainly can be incidents of severe disease. In Waukesha County, it's usually somewhere between 1 to 3 children end up in the hospital. But that's been the case kind of throughout some months you'll have 0, some months you'll have 1, 2, maybe 3 that end up hospitalized of school-aged children. So we have not seen in Waukesha County a substantial increase in hospitalizations based on what the county's reported.
I guess my second question, Mike, is thank you for that. What's the temperament related from parents regarding the desire for a full remote option? I know that we didn't have enough of a demand for that, right, to do any of that as a scheduled activity? Are we seeing an increase in that request?
I have not had, the principals I think might get it once in a while. I think we have some families who were probably among, fair to say, the original population that wanted virtual, which was too small for us to staff it, that would still like to see a virtual option. The other side, I think, maybe of the question, Steve, is we did not get, I didn't hear any, and Pete jump in, or Anthony, really any issues or complaints from parents when we ultimately had to put those groups to virtual for that small period of time. Because I think it was pretty clear that we were working pretty hard not to do that if we could avoid it, and we kept it to a short number of days. But I have not had communication of people knocking on my door asking for a fully virtual option.
Thanks.
Others? Khadijah?
All right. Oh, go ahead, Khadijah.
I was just wondering, like, what factors would made you decide to go do testing for everyone versus like masking? If there's like any sort of like consistency in deciding, or whether it's just like a case by case basis.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Khadijah, and a lot of people want to know, like, at this number, you do X or Y, and in over 20 months of trying to manage this, there's an art to it as well as a science, that a number can be really misleading, and that's why when we built this, we used the word may, which might seem like a cop-out, but it's because I think you need to use judgment and ask a lot of analytical questions when you decided specifically what to do. So, for example, last year we had times in particular where rates were really high in the community, higher than we ever expected when we talked about it in the summer before the year started, that, well, boy, if it was like that, we were going to be closed. And inside the schools, it was okay. We weren't really having a high level of cases, and we were functioning just fine. When we look at some of these approaches, what is the rest of the story? So we might have 10 cases or 15 cases in a grade level, let's say. Well, when are those students coming back from quarantine? Was this a group of kids that were all on the same athletic team, or was it because of a sleepover? Do we have them already isolated? Do we think we have it contained? Is it kind of random, right? And we have to, this just seems kind of more widespread in that it's transmitting a lot at school, so do we need to put in some stronger things, whether it be a masking requirement or moving a group virtual or those kinds of things. So there's a lot of questions to ask when I'm talking to principals and nurses, and we're analyzing kind of what the dynamics of it are. We use the kind of metrics in the color-coded model to give us a real indication of what the spread is within the boundaries of the school district, because that is, your community spread is a big indicator of what you're likely to see. It's logical, right, that you're probably going to see inside your schools. But those two things don't always tell the same story, so we kind of need to look at both of them, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on that, it was mentioned at the citizen comments last time, and you mentioned it in your report there about data issues with the county. I mean, we try to steer by data. If they're not giving us the data, it kind of makes it more difficult. And what is the issue with the county?
Yeah, it's actually the state site. The county doesn't maintain a website anymore. It's the Wisconsin DHS site. Candace is here today, and we had some fun looking at that site today. You know, we've been using the 7-day rate for new cases, and that specific data point that we've been using and that we built the model on hasn't been updated since the 15th, as we looked at today. So now we're looking at, you can download all these different metrics, and some of them are different. Some of them are now positives plus probables. And we looked at one today that's confirmed that we kind of historically looked back, and it's close to what we were using, but it's always off by a couple. It's usually 1 or 2 more. So why they're updating some of those metrics and not others is a head scratcher. I know we put in a couple of tickets with them to ask those questions today. Sometimes we have days in a row where the data is just not updated, and we're just waiting and waiting for the state DHS to update it. So that's a challenge. The thing that we have the control over is our internal cases, so we have those counts. So those are things we update every single day. That external piece was working really smooth for a while. You know, I always believe in the adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, but maybe DHS doesn't think that. They started monkeying with something, and so I don't know. But the last couple of weeks, I would say even 3-ish plus weeks, it's been a little bit inconsistent in terms of that information. So last week with the numbers that I reported and looking at it today, I had mistakenly pulled the probable and positive cases, so it was higher. The rate was higher than it should have been for last week.
And how did the vaccine clinic go this weekend?
Very good. You know, that's a salute that I would do in a little bit to Colin and Sandy and everybody else. We had they administered 280 vaccines on Saturday, so we had about 300 signed up. Some couldn't make it, but that's the highest participation we've had at one of the on-site clinics.
When are they coming back for the second shot, Mike?
It's 3 weeks out for the second shot, December 11th, is it?
Whatever that Saturday is.
Okay.
All right, so my next slide was the dark red. Now we don't publish this in the weekly kind of updates, but that's in the master plan. So that is when we get, you know, we have red and then we have dark red. The metric was when we get to greater than 14 cases per day on average in the boundaries of the district. So there were some changes that were there. Again, they're similar theme you're going to see here, right? Moving from a required, that's the piece, and we'd actually talked about that a little bit at the meeting in August. That this is something that, in particular, the masking piece would require new board action, where a mask requirement could be implemented with no waiver accepted unless it was a specific medical waiver, which is more involved to get that waiver. So changing that from required to consider, again, if we're in that circumstance, would that be something we would want to do again, flexibly with groups if we saw that as advantageous to deal with a spike with a specific group. And then the bullet above that, move from a required quarantine, so that one does speak to that contact tracing piece. Right now, we have non-symptomatic close contacts are not required to quarantine or test. Moving up in levels, then you get to a test to stay, and this would have non-vaccinated individuals required to complete the quarantine and not have the eligibility to take a test to return. So those are moving those from required to may require as strategies that could be implemented. So again, moving that similar theme to what we saw with the others. And then last slide here, just the rationale for what we're recommending. As I've said, situations can vary by school or grade level. Cases have consistently been lower in grades 7 through 12. So what we see internally is what the state reports in their data, that in grade levels that have had access to be fully vaccinated, we see lower cases. We don't see the snowball or the big jumps in cases. And again, I always want to be clear because I know this is a sensitive issue. This is not a judgmental statement. We very much believe that a choice to be vaccinated is a personal health decision. This is just what the data tells us is what I'm sharing here. So what we have experienced and what the state DHS site shows is that we have substantially lower rates of infection. I think the state data right now is about 5 times difference vaccinated versus unvaccinated. So we consistently don't see the number of cases, 7 through 12. So we anticipate, as we're kind of thinking about our mitigation approaches here, now that the 5 through 11-year-olds are eligible, that as that vaccine is deployed, we would expect to see cases come down there. And so that's a consideration. I think we have a good chance we would be back talking about our plan maybe later in January about, all right, everybody's had full opportunity to be vaccinated. What does that mean for our operations? And then flexible use allows us to target strategies where the problem exists without necessarily imposing restrictions where it may not be necessary or productive to do so. So that's the rationale for the recommendations. So I'd be happy to take any other questions that you have.
So we heard the edits that Mike's suggesting. Any more questions for Mike before we look for a motion?
Mike, generally speaking, have the parents been pretty good about keeping sick kids home?
I would say probably, I don't know if it's fair to say maybe better than last year. Although we have cases where parents still send sick kids to school. What I would say is definitely better, and this kind of, and I'm actually glad you asked this question because it brings up a point that I wanted to make. Sometimes we get better compliance with things that are voluntary or that don't impose different requirements. So for example, we've noticed and feel that we get much better or much greater willingness for people to get tested and share testing results with the school, knowing that if my child is positive, I'm not putting your child in quarantine as a close contact. So I think we get much better cooperation with that. There was, frankly, a ton of social pressure on kids and families last year not to get tested because, you know, they might put 4, 5, 10 kids into quarantine as non-symptomatic close contacts. So that's been improved, but I know we had another incident today where we certainly had a student who shouldn't be here who was here, and we didn't have great cooperation. So we still have some problems, but I think most people are pretty good about it.
Did I see another hand, Larry?
Yeah, just because I don't think it was clear on your slides, Mike. I mean, there was a comment about the dark red, whether or not we accept your edits to that or we totally eliminate it. And I guess I'm a little cautious about totally eliminating it because all we've seen in terms of since the start of the school is like it was, you know, kind of green, yellow, and then now we're into orange and, you know, migrating into the red. I mean, I don't know where it's going to end up, but to take out that dark red implies that we won't reach that spike or that level, but.
Yeah, and in my comments to you, I said that's a consideration that it could be, we could function with the red level and just work within those strategies without, I don't know how much we gain, quite honestly, by the additional, you know, I guess a little bit more restrictive measures as we go up to dark red. You know, you take away you make it limited to a medical waiver. I don't know how much of a difference that will ultimately make. Maybe it would, maybe it wouldn't. I think the test to stay approach is a pretty strong factor there. You know, we can always come back to the board. I guess this was my comment on that, is we can always come back and say, you know what, things are continuing to become a stronger issue, and we think we need stronger measures, and then we'd come back to this group and ask for those things. So it's really how the board feels if we should keep those pieces in, or if we need to add additional measures, that we just come back to the board for strengthening those things.
So I guess clarification, you're suggesting dark red is out for this edit?
I would, you know, what I said was dark red could be, I would be comfortable trying to operate with the measures through red, or with the changes, with the flexible changes that I've put in place. It's whatever you're more comfortable with.
like the changes that you made in the dark red. I mean, the dark red gets us up to greater than or equal to 15, right? And we're in the red is like 10.
Correct.
So, I mean, we don't know. We don't know if there's gonna be another tier to this. I mean, we're heading into the more winter, indoor, holidays, that kind of stuff. I don't know what those numbers are gonna be, but given that we put together a plan last summer that had allowed for that, and based on that, I'm kind of inclined to keep that kind of plan intact, because that's what we told our community. It's what we published out there, and it's what we've gone public with, and I don't mind the tweaks or the changes to it, but to take it out totally says, well, we really didn't need dark red, or we don't need dark red in my thought process, but.
Or just an alternative possibility is that we've learned even more. We're seeing that that level of action may not be necessary, and so it's possible we just don't need to have that level of escalation. So I'm okay actually with the suggestion of eliminating it.
But it has to be, it gets up to 15, okay, I mean, and again, we started out in the yellow, I think ranges, right, green, yellow, if you will.
Yeah, we were yellow all year except for 1 week we were green until we
But now
got
we're
orange.
into red,
Yeah.
so.
Yep. Yeah, and just to kind of give you the history of where those benchmarks came from, that was looking historically. So when we do get to that 15, that gets us to really as high as we were last year.
So there's a basis for
yeah.
it, and I think that's my point, is it's
Right.
like we're kind of taking that out, but we leave it in, otherwise we're gonna come back in a debate whether we do it. And again, we've moved the number to 15, so it's the worst, maybe, like you said, worst case scenario compared to last year, so I don't know if I'm, it's like, why eliminate the whole thing
Yeah.
when we know that we might, we don't know. We
It
don't know what's
it
gonna
does
happen.
provide us with options, and at some point we only have so many options. I guess is part of it too, is that the school district has short of closing, which I don't think we anticipate doing that. I hope to God ever again for any extended period of time. We only have so many tools in our toolbox. So, but that does, when we get to the dark red, I guess that ultimately gets us to
Well, and we don't know
maximizing
exactly,
the
too, what's gonna
in-person
happen with the
procedures.
K to 6 vaccinations. I mean, you said you had 280, but that's 280 out of how many? It's like,
Well, and that was just an on-site clinic. I know lots of people have been. I mean, if the history with the other age groups tells us anything, I think we'll move pretty quickly to about 40%. And then we'll progressively go up from there. We are, right now, I would estimate we're about 62% at the high school. And we are, probably roughly 58% in the grade levels below that, based on what the data from the county site shows,
so
the state
then
site.
another way to ask the question, is there a risk of keeping it in? I mean.
There's no risk in keeping it in. It's just how you want to proceed. Like I said, it does provide options as cases escalate.
It provides some guidance, and again, it's what we
does.
published originally.
So Larry, would you like to make a motion to accept the changes but keeping in the dark red?
That would be my motion exactly, sir, so yes,
Hey,
accept
Larry.
all the other changes.
Larry,
except
I have a
keep
question
dark
for
red.
you. What if, in keeping that dark red, we just raised the numbers from the 15 to like 20 or something like that? I mean, I wasn't here when you guys made this up, so I don't know what went into those numbers exactly.
Yeah, I would say, so the 15 is, we were at 14, so that did bring it up just one. I'd be careful. I'd want to go back and relook. I mean, it was based on some study of our historical rates. It wasn't just a number pulled out of,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what.
so, so that's, if we wanted to look at the benchmark, I could go back and try to look at the history of the benchmarks again. So the idea with that is, I mean, it is at a high rate of transmission. We are currently at a high rate of transmission in the community, the highest we've been at all school year, by any measure that you look at. I mean, we do not have statewide the cases in total that we had a year ago, where we had that November surge. But from this school year, we're certainly at a pretty high rate at that.
The
that
same
15.
thing is, as you said, I mean, if you want to bring it back, we could bring it back, but given that we already have it in place, if you feel that we need to relax it at some point and say, okay, well, we're not gonna get to the 15, or we need to, I guess to me, I just didn't like, wanna take it totally out.
Yeah.
But I'm okay with the number changes and the wording changes that you've got in there, so.
Well, we do have a motion on the floor, so you made a motion to accept the
Accept changes.
changes, except for the keeping the dark red in there.
With
um,
the wording changes.
With the
yeah.
wording changes, right, understood. We need a second,
Second.
all right. All in favor, signal by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Motion carries 7-0. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, and I would, just as I think I've already really provided the update on cases. I would just add, and I sent that to you later in the day because we always try to get end-of-day data on Monday. We'll see where we are tomorrow, but projected to tomorrow. Well, in terms of spread in the community, we're currently right about at that 14 number for spread, and so in that red category. Internally, cases were 11. We're down with 11 less cases, 33 projected for tomorrow active for students in the district. So we have kind of seen that flattening and a little bit of a drop unless we suddenly get a bunch tomorrow. And staff cases are down, so we have 2 staff members out at this time. So that's...
What do you expect to happen next Monday?
Well, and that's, and I did get a couple emails on this, and this was a little bit of my point I mentioned earlier, is that as we went to these modified approaches these last 2 weeks, what we have experienced was actually kind of the opposite of what we were told we might experience. Last year, you might recall, there was lots of concern that you would see post-holiday increases. Generally, we see cases tend to relax a little bit after a break. That may not happen this time. So we're going to have 6 days where kids are going to be around each other less than they were previously. But again, the community spreads real high, so I don't know. I would expect we would probably have lower cases, at least within the system when they return after 6 days out. But it's hard to say. You really have to wait, 4 or 5 days after they return to really get a sense of where things probably are at. Last year, late November, things were surging, and based on what we were being told, we fully expected we'd probably all be shut down in December because things were going so high, and then it just dropped like a stone and cases dropped off. So that's one thing we know from experience is this thing doesn't always do what we think it's going to do.
Thank you.
I have a question. Mike, have you thought about contacting our representatives about the lack of reporting on DHS?
We haven't contacted them. Right now we're trying to reach DHS and see what they have to say about the data reporting. So, but that's a good suggestion. If we don't hear from them, we can certainly reach out to them to try to apply a little pressure. Because it does have us sometimes flying a little blind for a few days at a time here. So that's all I have.
Well, thank you, Mike. Going down to the next agenda item is comments from citizens. Do we have any slips, Julie?
I do not.
Nobody's running towards the microphone? Okay.
Can we go back to the very red screen?
A little louder, please.
The red screen.
Dark red or regular red?
Dark red.
Okay.
Which is what level of students?
That is when the 7-day rate, based on what was approved as 15 or greater,
Of the whole campus?
of its cases within the boundaries of the school system. So the rate that we're using it includes adults and students in terms of that external metric. But we always balance that with what's happening inside. That's to Khadijah's question. I was saying we really got to look at the whole picture. And really the change, we got to go one more, Julie, that one. So the change really moves it from a requirement of these things to the ability to use it flexibly as an option.
I guess my comment would be, Larry, would be risk reward. We've seen how poorly the students did during the COVID virtual learning environments, and how little risk there is to them. Yes, they get COVID. Okay, are they dying? Are they needing lung transplants? No. They're okay. They get colds, they're home for a week or 10 days or whatever it is, and we move on. I think the most important piece is to really stress to parents, when my kids don't feel good, even if they're just tired, their body's exhausted, they stay home. They sleep all day. They don't need to have a fever. They don't need to be throwing up and vomiting for me to be like, oh, I'll come The reason,
No,
No,
Can
no,
I
no.
say something? The
Yeah.
reason that I voted yes to this is because the languages may be required.
Yeah.
And there will be involvement, there will be discussion.
And Katie, this doesn't speak to a virtual learning. This speaks to one, and I guess if you want to make a comment, we should probably have you come up with the microphone because no one on the stream can hear you. But I would just, to your question, and for our listeners at home, there's questions about the dark red protocols. All this does not speak to at all about moving to a virtual. Changing a learning environment is not based on these metrics. It's based on, and there's, if you go to the master plan, and the revised one will be published, but this language won't change in terms of learning environment change. We look at all of the information, and there's a series of questions that we consider. So when we moved 6th grade virtual, we looked at our internal cases, we looked at the rise of that specific group. It wasn't specific. This is really about how we might address things like testing, masking, testing and masking, really primarily in the district, and contact tracing and quarantine. So this really more drives kind of an escalating and a de-escalation of those approaches. And any kind of change to a virtual like we did with 6th grade, which was only for a couple of days this go around, anything longer than 2 weeks, the board would have to take formal action to extend that. So that would be a whole new board action to do those things. And so I think the track record from the school year is we've worked really hard to avoid that, as we've had very little of that happen this year. Yep. Agreed. Thanks, Katie.
Before we move down to salutes and recognitions, Julie, did you grab that for comments for us?
For the minutes.
For the minutes? Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm opening it now to salutes and recognitions to the board, if anybody has any.
Well, it's hard not to recognize the Pewaukee High School football team.
That was a softball to you there, Larry.
Yeah, I know, for making it to the state tournament and coming away with a victory. I didn't make it to all of the playoff games, but I did go to the Whitefish Bay one, the one that they played in Muskego with Monroe. And between the combination of the players, the coaches, it was an outstanding performance. They came back at Muskego against Monroe, and it was a close game on Friday morning against Rice Lake. And I think our coaches and players just did an outstanding job. And I appreciate all of the wonderful, wonderful accolades that the Pewaukee School District has received as a result of that. And lots of parents, we were trying to estimate the crowd size.
I think it was
2,000, 3,000,
4,000, I think it was more
4,000.
like 4 or 5,000.
Yeah, I
It was a
thought
big,
Rice
big crowd
was
there.
It was
my
massive.
initial guess, yeah.
It was massive.
It was way
So
more
salute
than
to the
Rice.
crowd. I don't think we're sending cards out to everybody, but
No.
salute to the crowd.
Yeah, the community.
So Julie, if you could salute the 4,000 people who came to the game. I would say to save,
You and Brian have to sign.
I would say to save Brian and I from signing, and Julie from, we do plan to invite, you recall at basketball, we invited them to board meeting at the December board meeting to be recognized. So I don't know that Julie has to write out 60 or 70 salutes for this, if you're comfortable, Larry, but I think it's really good to recognize them here at the meeting, obviously.
Other salutes and recognitions, Stacy.
Last week I was able to participate a little bit with the Horizon Book Fair that, Susie Olson, did I have that right, Pete? Susie Olson kind of chaired, and then with Sarah Gull and Christine Barr, and I think it was one of the most successful book fairs, if I remember.
It was. Usually we clear about $6,000. This one was over 11. Wow. And $5,000, not including the $5,000 went right back into classrooms and our book room.
And it was done on a very lean group of volunteers. So those three kind of headed it up. During virtual conferences, so the traffic was light.
We call that small but mighty. Small
Exactly.
but mighty group.
Kadisha, you had a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to just salute like the administration that has been like working on the different like fan buses and getting students out to like games, and there's just been a lot to coordinate around that, and I think it's been also for multiple events, and I think just putting that all together, they've done a great job. So I think, yeah, the high school administration that's been working on that.
Thank you for that. Anyone else before I turn it over to the administrators? Any else? Mike?
All right, I got a bunch of them for you, Julie. So again, I would echo Khadijah's comments and Larry's, Justin Frisky, Mike Lecker after 54 years. Getting his opportunity to hold up that gold ball was, I think, one of the great stories of this season. That football team just really got on a run, and it was really fun to see the community come together. So again, we'll be recognizing them at the meeting, and we'll invite them to the meeting in December. Again, to follow up on Khadijah's comments, Jeff Behrens, Brian Sniff, Paul Bursai, and Brenton Roberts. Having been a high school principal when we took a team to state championship in a different school, it's one of the most exhausted times I've ever been in my life. That is an exhausting week, and people don't realize the hours and the tremendous amount of energy and work that goes into all the logistics that happen behind the scenes to try to make a real special event. So really kudos to those guys for all the work that they did to reorganize schedules, to work through with staff in terms of who's going to the game, who's chaperoning, making sure that the players had all their needs taken care of, getting hotels set up, being able to practice at Edgewood High School in that afternoon, everything that goes into it. It's a huge undertaking. The other piece, and I'd like to recognize, and this is kind of a general one, Julie, so I just want to say it at the meeting. You don't have to write out cards for this one, but our student services staff today, this is what they do. They had to step up to the plate. What people don't realize is we had a lot of staff members and a lot of families who were present at that Waukesha parade that witnessed very traumatic things yesterday. We have staff members who couldn't come to work today, who were providing first aid to victims on site, and who witnessed fatalities. This was a really terrible thing that happened, and it's very heartbreaking. But our student services team stepped up to not only provide information and support to help me with communication, but to check in with staff, to call people at home, to make sure that they were doing okay, that they have what they need. We had staff recognize Rachel Yerk and Michelle Davison, who helped us get 3 therapy dogs here today to comfort staff who are struggling, and to just the work that they did identifying students. We had a lot of emails from parents whose kids were directly affected by this event, so those folks need to be recognized as well.
Thank you. We're going to go down to the consent agenda. We have minutes from the 2 previous meetings of the board and the business affairs, some correspondence, a generous grant from PPG Innovative Classrooms, and then we have policies from the last board meeting. Unless there's questions or corrections, I'll look for a motion to accept the consent agenda.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, signal by saying aye.
Aye.
Motion carries 7-0. Down to old business. Didn't feel that old. New course recommendations, possible approval. Danielle, did you get any questions in all preceding weeks? Okay. All right. Unless there's any questions or concerns about those changes, I look for a motion to approve those new course recommendations.
I move to approve the new course recommendations for English Language Arts, Creative Nonfiction, Expository Writing, Insight, Aviation, the Flying Environment, and Flight Planning, and Serving Others. Serving Others, Education, Community, and Human Services, Pathways to Teaching Revision.
Second.
All in favor, signal by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? 7-0. Thank you for that. Now down to new business. I see we have some folks here from Robotics. We have 2 field trip requests, so come on down.
We've seen these guys before.
Yeah, you've seen us before. Good evening, everyone. Good to see you again. There you are. My name's Dale Knoll, and this is Carol Knoll, who is one of my assistant coaches. So, as you probably remember, last season we didn't really get to do much outside of the school as far as the robotics program. And you know how exciting it is for the students to actually get out there and compete with the robot that they designed and built. Well, this year it looks like we have the opportunity at this moment First is announced that they are having in-person competitions unless something changes. So we have registered for the Wisconsin Regional, which is a local one, which we aren't looking for permission to go to that one. But we also did register for the Duluth Regional, or the Northern Lights Regional up in Duluth, which is an overnight stay. Should we be successful at one of those two regional events, typically we would go to Detroit for our championship. Unfortunately, about a week ago, the first announced that they had canceled the Detroit championship and everybody's going to Houston. And we're still working out the details of what it would take to get to Houston. As you can imagine, it's a little bit more expensive. But we did get a quote from Wisconsin Coach Lines / Coast USA, and it's about $17,500 just for the bus. But that's about all I can tell you right now. We haven't even been able to look at hotels or anything, should we be going to Houston. Other than that, I would be happy to answer any questions anybody has about either of the field trips. I can answer them the best as I can, or any other questions about the robotics program.
I am curious about why the slight change in neighborhood there from Detroit to Houston.
Well, I don't have all the inside details. From the information that was sent out to all the coaches, they did have Houston and Detroit in back-to-back events. Houston is April 20th through the 23rd, and then Detroit would have been the week after. And they said that it was too much for their volunteer staff to be able to do back-to-back championship events on opposite ends of the north-south of the country.
Okay, so that's why they didn't pick one of the 6 big cities in between those two?
Well, Houston is where they have the championships for the southern half of the states typically.
Okay.
So that's not a new venue for them. They're just canceling the Detroit venue.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, it would be great if we were back in St. Louis again like it was before. That would be awesome, but unfortunately they don't do that. They haven't done that for
Steve?
15 years.
I would just ask that if you can find a way to make it happen, if you qualify for Houston, please go.
Well, I'm going to continue to, our business team is working on our sponsorships right now. We did actually do fairly well with our sponsorships last season. So we have a fair amount banked up that we didn't spend because we didn't go anywhere. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to make it work no matter, one way or another. I'm sure our sponsors they get very excited when we win our regionals as well, and they get a little more generous again. So I'm fairly confident we'll make it work. I just don't know what it's going to look like yet.
Will twice the number of teams be in Houston then? Or will it not?
I can't really say that. I mean, typically it's about 400 teams per championship.
Okay.
But one of the concerns that first had in the decision to move everything to Houston was that because different school districts have different requirements and things in the state of the world today with the pandemic and such, they still don't know how many teams are going to be able to travel. So they felt it was in the best interest to just consolidate it down into one for this season.
Larry?
So, just to clarify, just a teeny bit. So the Northern Lights or the Milwaukee one, you get two potential chances to qualify for the national.
That
right?
is correct.
Okay, so.
If we won either one, or preferably both, like we did in 18. But yeah, either one will give us an opportunity to go down to Houston.
I move to approve the Pewaukee High School robotics team to travel to the Northern Lights Regional in Duluth from March 2nd through the 5th, 2022, and the Wisconsin Regional in the Panther Center. I know we don't need to approve that one. And if opportune, the Houston World Championships, April 2nd or 20th to the 23rd, 2022.
Second.
Don't know who got that, but, all right, all in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed? 7-0.
All right,
Good
thank
luck.
you very much.
Thank you. Good luck.
Yes.
Thank
Good
you.
luck.
Have a great season.
All right. on to the data assessment report. We have Candace here in person, live
Yeah,
in person.
as Candace is coming forward, I'd just kind of set the table here a little bit, and Danielle can jump in if she would like as well. So this is an important part of our annual accountability practices. Oh, thank you for picking that up. Where Candace gives a real nice overview of key metrics for the district. So this is always a good opportunity to take that comprehensive look at how we're performing. Candace puts a ton of work into this and is an incredible resource in terms of breaking down those metrics. So I don't know, Danielle, if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I'll just add that Candace and I will tag team a couple of things on this. I'm going to stay here for the sake of the live stream so that we have both mics that her and I are working off of. And then I'll just also kind of note that when we take a look at like our rankings and comparables to other districts, we're going to look at grades 4, 6, and 8. We usually don't do all of the grades, so we chose the grades that represent the trends that we see, and we'll talk a bit about that as we get into each of that and those pieces. Of course, if any board member would want to see anything in greater detail, of course, you can always let me know and we'll set up a time to meet and talk a bit further. So I'll turn it over to Candace.
All right, so we'll start off with the annual assessment report. Just starting out with, like we typically do, taking a look at those enrollment and demographic trends. When we look at enrollment this past year, it did decrease slightly. With that decrease, it ended up being negative 69 over the last 5 years. So it's quite a bit of a dip in 1 year to occur. This primarily happened in PLE and Horizon. PLE, that's still holding for those grade level changes. And it was about a decrease of 40 to 50 students in PLE and 22 students at Horizon. So that's where we're seeing that occur. Our projected estimate of enrollment will have 22 additional students over last year for this year, so we're already seeing that rebound a little bit. When we look at our race demographics, we have approximately 21.3% of students that identify as a minority. This really increased between the years of 2011 and 2015 and has been having slight increases since then, but not as dramatic as those course of years. Our largest population is students that identify as Asian, coming in at 8%, followed by students that identify as Hispanic at 5.9%. It is important to keep in mind that if you check any race and check Hispanic with that, you are automatically filtered into that Hispanic category. So just something to keep in mind. And that does differ then from the third largest group of 2 or more. So you have that Hispanic ethnicity that takes precedent over any other race minority selection, which differs from 2 or more, where you could select 2 or more. When we look at just the hard numbers of students identifying as a racial minority, we have 614 students identifying as a racial minority last year. This has tripled in the past 15 years. It did decrease from 2020. However, the relative decrease for students identifying as a racial minority did not decrease as much as the hard numbers of those overall student body populations we saw, kind of resulting in less of a decrease here that we see. You can see the straight down line there. Then moving on to English language learners. As anticipated, with a more diverse population, we have more students that speak a different language than English as their primary language. So an overall increase coming up to 60 students for the 2021 school year.
So Candace, can we attribute that to anything? I mean, we see a couple of points in the history where this jumps substantially from 2013 to 2014, it doubled, and then it's gone up another 50% since what was kind of flat for about a 6 or 7 year period there into these last 2 years.
For 2020, there was a combination of 2 factors. We did see an increase in students, but we also had a different staff personnel that looked at the criteria a little differently than prior staff personnel did.
Okay.
And that's not to say that prior was wrong.
Yeah.
It was more so trying to be more inclusive and keep
Got
more
it.
students in the program.
Thank you for the context.
But in 13 to 14, we also see a similar jump. I would not be as familiar with why
Yeah.
that jump might have occurred. It could be many, many factors.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just a quick comment on that, Steve. So, and Candace, correct me if I'm not, if this isn't the right analysis, but you graduate students
Yep.
from in essence that ESL category when they hit certain levels on there. So, one coordinator may be more liberal in graduating people, and some might be more conservative in keeping them. We do see this sometimes in other areas, like, you know, it could be speech and language, right? Where some might identify a little bit higher number, some might, you know, so it's a little bit of that factor when you change personnel.
Got it,
Yes,
thank you.
that is absolutely correct, Mike. You have to have at least it's a numeric number of 5 on the test, but then the coordinator must also look at other data points to decide whether you can graduate if you hit that point.
Thanks.
Economically disadvantaged students, there was a slight decrease into last year as we headed into the 2021 school year. One really important thing to keep in mind is that these numbers are taken from the 3rd Friday of September counts. We do know that as the school year of 2021 continued, that population continued to grow across the school year. And so by time we get to spring, we have an increase of up to 14.2%. So quite a bit higher than when we started in the fall. One particular reason that happened is some of the data that we would typically correct was not required for us to collect for students to receive those benefits at the beginning of the school year. As we went through the school year and more students needed other items outside of the free and reduced lunch, which is just one qualification, that's when we started to receive more of that data collection when students needed that assistance. When we look at special education, from 2009 to 2016, we saw a marked decrease in the percent of students that were considered special education, dropping from 10.4% to 6.6%. Since 2017, we have increased to 8.9% of students qualifying for special education services. This is a little different from our county and aspiring districts that we look to for comparables. They go between 11 and 12% and 10 and 11% respectively. Just a little bit lower. And that covers our student demographics. Are there any questions specific to demographics? Awesome. So we'll move on to student achievement data. And one of the first components we're going to look at is STAR expected growth for grades 6 through 8. This ranged from students in 8th grade reading meeting 44% of meeting expected growth to 61% of grade 8 students in math meeting expected growth. Then we move into growth goals. So the compete growth goals are a little different from the STAR that we just looked at for the middle school because they combine different factors. And so we put them on one chart here to really have a solid comparable, but they can use different assessments, and you'll see them as outlined differently within the graduate profile for Fountas and Pinnell data, STAR data, Dreambox data. We pull all of that into each of these. And so for PLE, we see they had 89% in reading and 89% in math last year, going down to 40%, and then in reading going down to 40% in reading, 89% in math this year. Like, yep. Yeah. Okay. Going on to forward math. There we go. In grade 8, we have the lowest range with 37.1% of students being proficient in math, ranging up to, in grade 3, 82.5% of students. For grade 3, that is a pop-up over several of the last years, but it has been trending every other year in that direction. For grade 8, that is lower than their typical progress. However, if we look back to prior years, it would be in the range of those prior years, not the last two. One important piece to take into consideration is that the 2020 school year is missing from here. They did not take the forward in that year.
So we're going to dive into all of these a little bit here in just a few moments, but just a couple of notes here is that, for grades 3, 4, and 5, those scores are the highest we've seen in the history of the forward exam, and we know that, kind of prior to what is shown on the chart, then we had the Badger and then the WKCE, right? Completely different exams, so can't compare back to those pieces. We obviously see a decline in grades 6, 7, and 8, which we'll dive into here a bit more. We'll also show some comparable data to the pre-ACT in grade 8 as well, because we kind of have a tale of two stories there. So we're going to break all this down just a little bit more.
So we move from math to English language arts. Grade 8 had 42.9% of students considered proficient, and grade 6 had the highest with 63.9. So a little bit of a different grade level there than math. The English language arts proficiency are a bit tighter as well. You can see that math had quite a wide range. English language arts much closer together, really centering around that 50% if I was going to draw a line or estimate on a dartboard or something like that. So now we can see how we did. We're going to dive into the comparables and how we ranked against other districts and how they did. When we look at the 4th grade math, we're really looking at a marked change this year from the both comparing to themselves and also looking at a change in their rankings. Jumping from really a stable, steady line at the bottom to really jumping up at the top.
So just a note on this, so grade 4, what you're going to see for both math and reading is going to be pretty stable to what we saw in grades 3, 4, and 5. So we saw these same types of rankings in math for grades 3, 4, and 5. If you recall, we began a new math curriculum implementation last year. We use a primary resource called Bridges in the elementary schools. One of the primary features of that resource and the scaffolding of the curriculum changes that we made is the use of a lot of building on concepts throughout the year versus doing concepts in isolation. So we have something called Number Corner, which you might recall we had a spotlight on learning with Lisa O'Hearn a while back. Those types of features have really increased our students' understanding of math concepts, so we're really pleased with how the new math implementation is going at the elementary level and how quickly students are engaging with it. And I think every grade we've heard students and teachers say that kids are coming this year now in year 2 with more secure concepts than where they would typically have started in years past. So we're encouraged by that and believe that, we should hopefully maintain this level of performance with the changes that we made in the curriculum. So we feel good about that. You'll also recall that a few years ago, grade 4 in particular, as you can see there, right, had a trend that we were not as pleased with, and we started implementing what we call learning sprints, basically 6 weeks at a time, working on a very specific instructional strategy, and our learning coaches are deeply embedded in our classrooms assisting with that, and then using data in real time to do that. So that strategy over the course of the last 3 years has really gone from something we tried in 4th grade to something we're doing across the grades, particularly at Horizon, and now we're expanding that into the middle school as well as the high school a bit, but really going to start focusing that same strategy at the middle school, as we see some data pieces there that we want to improve upon. So a combination of curricular changes as well as instructional changes and approaches and support for our staff, we think is leading to this. And again, this is trends across grades 3, 4, and 5.
So similar to the county, the high achieving math rankings also tell that same story. Marked increase in performance proficiency, and then also comparable to other districts, a market increase. Moving to English language arts for the county, we see a relatively stable line for rankings, not kind of seeing a lot of bouncing around, not really doing a whole lot of differentiation there. That continues on. We see a little bit of an increase. I'm not certain I would say that would be a complete trend when we look at the county and kind of pull that in all together, but a little bit higher than other districts in the high achieving, but still we're looking at something that's relatively stable for reading in grade 4, which is different from the math we've seen.
Yeah, and I would say that from a reading standpoint and English language arts standpoint, by and large, with the exception, I would say, at the high school where we see a pretty healthy and stable performance at the top for ELA. ELA's stayed pretty stable across the board. It's solid, but there's room for improvement there. If you recall, we're in the midst of curriculum renewal right now. That'll come to you in the spring. So there's opportunities, certainly in ELA, for us to more consistently improve. As you saw there in 4th grade, which is true if we looked at the other grades as well, and you'll see that even at the middle school, a little bit of bouncing, just kind of up and down without consistency, which means that there's some practices that we need to shore up and improve upon, which is what the curriculum process is designed to do. And so part of that we know is going to be, as it says there, alignment to the new Wisconsin state standards. There are new standards in ELA, and so that's what we're actively working on. We know that the forward, we have been told at least, that the forward will be updated by 2023 to reflect the new state standards in ELA, so we want to make sure that we have those implemented and that we're working on improving those before our students then start obviously taking that assessment. Don't know exactly what those changes will mean on the assessment. So I just wanted to put in a small note around our action plans at the elementary level before we move on to the secondary. I know that last week I sent you a much more comprehensive document that outlined things in greater detail, and inside of those I have even greater details, right, that we internally our teams work on and stuff, but just to sort of highlight some of the action steps that we're taking in the teaching and learning department. In both math and English language arts, we focus on all students having 1-year growth goals that's supported in the use of data in real time. Those are primarily STAR that we use those in, but also Number Corner and Dreambox to some extent. And that's what we're looking at every roughly 6 to 8 weeks, and then making those adjustments to our learning sprints, and then tracking that that rate. And so when you see the PLE and Horizons compete goals, when we get to the graduate profile in a bit, that's what those are based off of, is how many students are meeting those growth goals. Obviously, you want them growing 1 year's worth of growth in 1 year's time. We want our students who are our lowest performers actually growing more than 1 year in 1 year's time, and that's a piece that we're really starting to try to analyze a little bit more deeply this year. We also have been providing a lot of additional training for our interventionists and our special education staff on reading and writing strategies, as well as some math strategies, though reading and writing are the ones that we're kind of focusing on now, because again, we saw that sort of stable line, but area for improvement there. So we had some staff get trained over the summer in Sunday system, as well as our interventionists. We took a look at sort of the whole gamut of our interventionists and what all of our interventionists have been trained in, and where do we have gaps. And so each of them sort of had a specialized training that they are continuing to work on. And then we continue to review our schedules to make sure that we're maximizing our instructional time. COVID was an interesting learning piece for us, especially when we took a look at math. I remember Brian Siegel making the comment that one of the things that changed in math is we got through all of the curriculum last year because we didn't have some of the other things that happen in a school year, which are all very positive experiences, right? Trips to the theater and other things of that nature. Those are all positive experiences, but we actually, when kind of all we could do was focus, on those core pieces, we were able to get through everything, and even in the year that was last year. And so that was an interesting learning piece. So we're continuing to analyze, right, how we utilize our time in all of our schools for that purpose. Any questions maybe on elementary before we move on to secondary? I know this is a lot of information and then more to come with the principals here tonight, so we can kind of chunk this out. All right.
Grade 6. So if we look at grade 6, they have been relatively stable. We see in the last 2 years a tiny decrease in their rankings, but overall, we're really talking about that same band of the same 4 right there in that range. This is with 54.5% of students being proficient in math this year, which, as you can see, is a little bit different from 2019, in which they were actually one lower with 64.6% of students proficient. So we can definitely tell that the 21 school year was very different for a lot of schools around us and in our aspiring districts. Same for high achieving. We see a decrease from 2016 and 17, but then really stable those last 3 testing years. Just coming in stable. When we get to grade 6 for the reading, we see a tiny bit more differentiation for 2019, a little bit lower than we saw in that math, but otherwise very, very stable. Just kind of straight across the board, reading, one dip back right up where they were. And then again, a little bit of fluctuation, but highly stable in the reading achievement, going up for 3 years, but then kind of coming back down to those same rankings as before.
So grades 6 and 7 are going to look very similar to each other as well, where you see, again, reading kind of staying stable over those years, or even in this case, rebounding from where it was previously. And with math, again, stable, but with a slight decline. Again, we had new math curriculum throughout K-12, and while we saw, right, some positive trends at the elementary, the implementation didn't go as smoothly at the middle school. Yes, some of that is going to be related to the disjointed year that was last year. We know that the middle and high school were in the blended model the longest, to the entirety of the first semester. We also know that ASA had the most disruption due to COVID, that their actual taking of the forward exam was disrupted and rescheduled multiple times. They went virtual right before they were supposed to take it. They ended up having to take it all on the same day, which is never a good testing strategy, math test being the last test of the day. All that being said, though, there is areas for improvement, and it's the building. And Anthony can speak to this more as well. It's the building that we have the most active action steps in, and that we're taking the most active strategies for improvement, starting specifically with having teams of teachers looking at data more regularly and analyzing it more deeply, and setting up and creating those learning sprints. They just had their first round of those data meetings last week, and Candace and I were looking at the dashboards that they have, that they're using student data, star data in real time to develop those. Robin and I have met with each of the teams at each of those grade levels to hear right from them what exact action plans they're taking to improve these, our scores, and so that way we understand, the action. And I will say that I've been very impressed with the amount of responsibility our staff is taking, that even though we could say COVID did this or COVID did that, they've said we can do better, and there's a trend line here that existed before COVID as well, which means, we have improvements that we can make, and they're being really active to ensure that happens.
So moving from grade 6 to grade 8, here is pictured both the pre-ACT data and the forward data. We wanted to show you this just as a direct comparable on the same chart, because as you can see on the forward test in ELA, there were 42.5% of students proficient. However, a couple weeks later when they took the pre-ACT, we jumped to 76.4% proficient on reading and 81.3% proficient in English language arts. So we're seeing a very stark contrast between those two subject tests, and we also seen that same contrast in math, in which we had 36.7% of kids proficient on forward. However, that jumped to 80.3% of students proficient on the pre-ACT. Science is a little bit of an outlier. The science test on the forward is only given in grades 4 and 8, so trying to run comparables to like grade 7 is a little difficult, but that's the only one that stands out there.
On this particular comparison, are the proficiency standards equal? I mean, because tests are different, right?
So the forward proficiency standards are going to be based on the Wisconsin standards and what is considered appropriate by the state and the committees they have put together for students to have learned. The pre-ACT is going to be based on your projected score to the ACT benchmark, which is then based on your projected performance in college classes in any of those subject areas. So for example, math is your base level math in college, and whether you will have a 50% chance or higher of getting a C in that class when you get there.
And the ACT suite of tests are based on the NGSS standards in science, and then the Common Core standards in math and English language arts, which the Wisconsin standards are aligned to those as well. Most educators consider both the Common Core and NGSS to be more complex standards and more rigorous standards than some of the Wisconsin state standards. But again, Wisconsin has continued to edit theirs, to be more aligned with that and stuff. So we use both sets of standards when we align our curriculum. And so, our students should be prepared to be able to be proficient in both categories. So just a little history context on this. Back in 2019, we had seen a similar trend specifically in 8th grade, where all of a sudden scores dipped, which you saw, right, clearly, and then by 9th grade they rebound, and it's like, well, what's going on in 8th grade, right? And so we thought that while there may be some curriculum pieces, and we continue to investigate those and improve upon those, we also thought that there may be some behavior pieces involved as well, as that 8th graders have figured out that the forward exam to them personally doesn't contain as much weight. It doesn't go into a grade. It doesn't have any bearing on any future kind of performance for them, whereas the ACT suite of tests, the pre-ACT, and prior to that, was the Aspire, and then it was the EPASS system, that those exams give you that predictive ACT score, and that ACT is still a test that's relevant to a lot of our students. Although a lot of universities now in a post-COVID environment are starting to not utilize the ACT as much, students still recognize that it's an exam that has some relevancy to them, to opening doors in the future for scholarships or universities. And so I think this is also reflective of students understanding that it's far more interesting to them to get that predictive ACT score than it is to take the forward exam. And so back in 2019, we actually had thought that there was something going on here. So we were going to administer the Aspire test starting in 2020 to do just this comparison between the two exams. Of course, 2020 happened. We didn't have any exams that spring, so we couldn't do Aspire for the first time in 8th grade. Then this past spring in 2021, we also were set to do Aspire, and kind of right at the 11th hour, we learned that the Aspire is no longer going to be the state assessment in grades 9 and 10 after this year, this coming spring. And so we thought, well, we're not going to get any trend data if we give our 8th graders the Aspire, so what options do we have? So we looked around and we figured out that the pre-ACT was a nice option. We give the pre-ACT in fall for 9th and 10th graders as well, so we would have historical data. We also anticipate, we believe that it's possible that the state will select the pre-ACT to replace the Aspire for the spring assessment for grades 9 and 10. But so this was actually the first time we were finally able to give both assessments in the spring to take that comparison look at what we thought had been happening kind of 2-3 years ago. And I think this kind of helps show that, yeah, we probably are onto something, that there is the students consider these tests differently when they're taking them. So it's a piece of information for us to take into consideration. That said, are there some things we should be doing to improve our forward exams? Yes. And we also know that the forward exams is what feeds our report cards from the state, right? And so we can't ignore the forward. We don't want to ignore the forward. It is aligned to our state standards, so it's something that we have to pay attention to. But I think it's important to understand, right, that we don't want to just lean in all on one assessment and really try to get a fuller picture of where our students are at.
And I would imagine, Danielle, that our students aren't all that different from students in the districts next door to us. So why our kids would care less about the forward than the kids who go to Sussex Hamilton, I guess I can't rationalize that.
Yeah, so that's exactly what we've said as well, right? Middle school kids are middle school kids to some degree, right? And so that's where it's interesting when we can start doing comparisons as well as looking at the report cards helps give us some of that. And so while our kids are middle school kids, just like the middle school kids in Sussex, something is going on where they're not, performing at the same level. So part of the conversation we've had at the middle school is how are we presenting the assessment to students, right? Are we making sure that we're emphasizing the importance of the assessment? So that's a piece of it on the behavior side. That said, there's some curriculum pieces, right, that we need to look at differently. There's some instructional pieces that we need to look at differently so that those districts that we are comparable to, we are competitive with. And so there's absolutely curricular pieces, which is why, again, we've taken the most aggressive action planning and steps at the middle school this year, starting most strategically with those data teams that are already meeting and setting up those learning sprints.
So as Steve was saying, when we move into those county math rankings, we look at Pewaukee with the 37.1% of students proficient. This is a little bit interesting in two parts. The first part is, oddly enough, we lost nearly 22% of proficiency from 2019. The ranking itself did not change that much, so clearly a little bit of issue across the state, across the county, and we'll see it in the aspiring districts as well, just struggling in general. Above and beyond that, this is one of the lower rankings. They're still pretty tight, with the outlier of really 2017-18 there coming in at 60.7%, and then just dipping up. Otherwise, they're all kind of lockstep together right there. Unfortunately, closer to the bottom than we would like to see. When we look at high achieving math rankings, a little bit closer to the bottom than the county rankings. So obviously not what we would like to see. We see those 2 years kind of popping up a little different from the county, in which we only see the 1 year popping up. So 2019 being different among high achieving versus the county districts for math. Then we move into the reading. Again, that 2017-18 popping up a little bit in the rankings, otherwise really kind of a little lockstep down there in the range of the 4, just above the bottom 3. 42.9% of students proficient, only a little bit lower than the 2019 proficiency rating. Not seeing quite as much differentiation in reading overall for the county scores when we kind of compare that to the math. Reading did a little bit better just in general. High achieving reading rankings, Again, a little bit down there towards the bottom. Not something we like to see for those rankings, but one popping up there as an outlier. For ninth grade Aspire, this is a state test that is given. This will most likely be the last year for the Aspire test by the state. We can see a high ranking of 81.4% proficiency in English, and then ranging only down to 56.8% in science. The gray lines are the state and their proficiency. As you can see, both for the state and us, English subtest of the Aspire, and we'll see it in the ACT, does tend to be much higher than the other subjects.
Do we not get comparative data for the Aspire?
Nope, I didn't rank those. We do. We have them all ranked out on dashboards, and we can definitely pull those for you for 9th and 10th grade.
They're stable over year after year. They're very, very consistent, and they tend to be high.
Much like the ACT ones we're about to see.
Yeah, what we
They're
see for
very
ACT
similar.
is going to be our trend for 9th and 10th grade as well. So we pop right back up in 9th grade.
For 10th grade, a little bit lower in English, 78.6% than 9th grade. Still very high for proficiency. In math, we see, again, a little bit lower than the 9th graders, but still coming in at 51.6%. And then quite a bit higher across the board than the state. Looking at the ACT average scores, the average composite score decreased just a little bit, but when we pop into the rankings, we're going to see that that isn't quite as apparent. In English, reading, and math, that slightly lower composite score is really where that's coming from. Science stayed the same as prior years, or at least the exact same as last year. The ACT, as a side note, is the only test that was given in 2020. The students took the test just about 2 weeks before schools shut down. So this is the only test that students did take that year. So when we jump into the rankings, we see that slight decrease to 22.4. However, we do see that that decrease wasn't as impactful when we look at other districts and how it related to them. We're staying right in that same range with Elmbrook at 23, which would be comparable to a couple lower spaces in prior years. So in 2020, Arrowhead had 23.9, really seeing a decrease in those upper scores.
So one thing to note, I think, on the ACT piece here is that if you, can you just go back real quick, Candace, to the composite ones, is that, as you know, on the ACT, it's hard to move to, you're talking about tenths of points, right? Because it's out of 36. And so to move those tenths of points. So while our composite score went down by 0.4, if you kind of look at some of the same comparisons, with the exception of Kettle Moraine, who's been on a nice trajectory up kind of the last few years, everybody else dropped, a little bit more than that. So, our students really didn't, composite score wise, change a whole lot, whereas other schools, even those that are consistently at the very top, had kind of a greater decrease over the last year, which again I think speaks to the testament of our students in these really crazy times that we were in.
One quick question on this one. This includes like now 100% of the students take the.
Yes. And we feel pretty confident that while I don't know the participation rate of all of the other schools, you'll hear that if you look at statewide data and nationwide data, participation rates were really low. When we're looking at our county and comparable districts and the high achieving districts, those participation rates are all going to be pretty stable to each other. I don't know that we specifically looked at participation rates and how much they changed, but I would at least surmise that it's likely that our county districts were pretty similar to us.
Yeah, the ACT participation did not change as much. When we look at the forward, that's where we see that participation changing quite a bit. When we do these rankings, we recalculate everyone's proficiency without those non-participants. So if you look at the state data, part of the percent of students that are considered proficient also includes the percent of students that are non-testers. And so we take those out and recalculate it so that it's really a level playing field to say, okay, out of who tested, what percent of those kids were proficient. Math. So again, in math, we're kind of seeing the same story here. We're seeing a decrease in that score a little bit this year, but really staying in exactly the same spot compared to 2020. And then we do see in the 3 years prior to that a little bit more movement, but not so much these last 2 years.
And one thing to note about math is that with the new curriculum that we've implemented, if you recall at the high school, that integrated model is graduating in, starting with Math 1 last year, 9th grade, Math 2 this year for our now sophomores, primarily sophomores. So we're really not going to see any ACT score reflection on new math curriculum for another full year. So, when they take it in the spring of 2023 would be the first time any students who are experiencing the new curriculum would be taking that assessment. So just something to note is that, we very likely could see, again, pretty stable results in math for another year, and then we'll start to see what the implementation of the curriculum has done for math.
When we look at the reading, again, we're seeing largely the same story. A little bit of a decrease in the score, but we actually went up in rankings relative to 2020. And then, again, comparable to prior years, very much in that same vein of alignment of where we're at. And for English, if 2017 weren't in the way, we would just be straight across the board, right in that second place. So hopefully we can either move to first or stay in second to really keep that chart just looking identical.
And I'll say that from an English standpoint, and you saw it with Aspire scores being high in English as well. If you recall, we moved to the workshop model as an instructional strategy in the last curriculum rotation, so now 5 years ago. And so, we're seeing very stable results, very high results in ELA at the high school level in that model. And so even though the scores have moved a little bit, our rankings continue to remain very high. So, spoiler alert, we're not going to be recommending any major instructional changes at the high school when it comes to the workshop model when we come back to you in the spring, because we're seeing, some consistency in really strong, stable scores there.
And then into science for the ACT subtest, again, same story, they had exactly the same score as 2020, and coming in just a little bit higher, but really maintaining a same area of the rankings, not a lot of movement there. So moving into the advanced placement exams participation, this year, for last year, 2021, there were 319 AP exams taken by students. That is a decrease from the year before, and I believe Danielle is going to talk a little bit more about credit-bearing programs, so I'm just going to get to the next slide here before anyone has questions. So when we look at the credit-bearing programs in higher education, these are programs that students participate in to potentially obtain credit. So not just the AP test where you have a 3 or higher and the school may or may not accept that. These students are earning credit through different programs. We have been increasing since we started implementing more of these programs. We do see a little bit of a decrease for the UW Green Bay programs for this year. And then just one note for the Start College Now and Early College Credit, those are semester 1 only. They are starting to do semester 2 enrollments, but they weren't quite done yet for today.
So the courses that you guys just previously approved are not, for second semester, are not included in these numbers. But yeah, we've, I think, talked about this now for a couple of years, that we were going to anticipate seeing a decrease in our AP participation rate because we're increasing these dual credit options. We continue to analyze every time we consider these as to which ones we do and don't take. So, for example, we brought forward a new one in English Language Arts, right, that you just approved tonight, as an elective, but AP Lang and AP Lit, which have been the standards in English, will remain as AP courses because of how they transfer to most universities, and therefore, you know, the you know, cost analysis for students, we always do whenever we're considering these. So sometimes we stay with AP and sometimes we recommend a switch, but that's why we see that participation rate. You know, I don't know that we have a lot of anticipated continued changes coming forward as far as these goes. I feel like we're going to kind of stable and level off now for a little bit, unless we see something really interesting taking place. But I would expect us to kind of start to see some stability in both these credit-bearing numbers of courses, as well as the AP participation rate. Larry?
So a quick question, and just trying to think about this in terms of from a value standpoint, do these credit-bearing programs kind of carry more value? Because the AP, you have to, in order to get the grade, you have to have a B or higher or something, or?
So the AP test, you have to score 3, 4, or 5 to be credit eligible, and then depending on the university that you go to, depends on which of those scores. Generally, a 4 or 5 is going to get you credits. A 3 can be kind of iffy. You know, the cost of an AP test is about $120 for it. The cost of these credit-bearing courses, it's about $100 per credit. Most of them are 3 credit classes. Some are 5 credit classes. So about $300 for the course. So it is, you know, a little bit more than double the cost of the AP class, but if you get a B or better, you're guaranteed the credits, and they transfer in the same way, right? So we switched U.S. history, for example, to the CCIHS course, right? So you're going to be guaranteed those history credits, and they're going to transfer the same way the AP U.S. history test did, except, you know, you don't have that risk of having to take a test, and we all know, like, right, tests can go well, and sometimes they don't go well, but consistency over many days to get a B or higher is much more. And that same class, if they were to take it as a freshman in college, is going to cost about 3 times as much. So a $300 class probably costs about $1,200 for the exact same class. So, you know, definitely more affordable for families with a more guarantee of credits, generally speaking, if the students, you know, if you feel confident that your child will be able to get the B or better, which, I mean, the vast majority of our kids do.
So the parent who asked the question before about the risk reward, the reward is much higher, right?
In this particular case, right? Yeah, the reward is much higher for most of these credit-bearing options than the risk is. In where the reward isn't high enough is where we've stayed with AP.
That purple bar is 17 because it's different on our chart, right? The Dual Enrollment Academy is 17, is that right?
Yes, 17.
Yeah, ours says 108.
Yeah, that's an old one. We figured out that there was an error in the file that WCTC sent us, and Candace and I talked about it. I'm like, there's no way that's 108. That would make no sense. That we'd have 108 kids in dual enrollment and stuff. So we had to figure that one out last week and stuff. And so we figured out they were counting every class as a student participant, which is not correct.
Yes. On the comment, though, I believe we did note that those kids are earning transcripted credit,
Yes,
right?
yeah,
So they are earning a form of credit, they're just not enrolled in these particular programs. Ooh, nope, I skipped you, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so then just to highlight a couple, I've already talked about much of this as we've been going through, so I won't spend a ton of time. And again, you have a more detailed document that I sent you last week. But, you know, at the secondary level, you know, we continue to deepen our instructional practices around the workshop, as well as disciplinary literacy and vocabulary strategies have been a long time strategy here at the high school since, you know, back when I was here at the high school too, so probably going on 7, 8 years now. Those strategies this year in particular were pushed down to the middle school. So again, when we take a look at ways that we're looking to improve the performance at our middle school, those disciplinary literacy and vocabulary strategies is a core strategy that we're looking at. We also are looking at a focus on research. The new state standards in ELA have research kind of, I would say, brought back into them, like that kind of traditional research paper wasn't an emphasis in the old standards, and it is back now, which I think is a real plus. And so starting in 7th grade in particular, and then going through high school, we'll be implementing a scaffolded curriculum for how students can conduct research appropriately, a little bit more rigorously than we previously had attacked that. From a math standpoint, we're using a foundational skills assessment to identify those areas of skill improvement. This has been hugely helpful. You know, the middle school in particular, right, they've acquired kids who've gone through the old elementary math curriculum, which we had obviously already identified some issues with, which is why we changed so much in this last curriculum implementation. Well, the middle school will be working with students who have had multiple years of that math experience for the next couple of years until, you know, sort of the students' experience in math now comes to them. And so they're using a foundational skills assessment to identify those skills in particular students, and then they're doing additional work with students during the flex periods, resource periods. So not only are our interventionists who've received additional training, and we've brought on more interventionists doing work with students, but all of our math teachers are taking intervention groups as well at our middle school to make sure that we shore up those foundational skills. And I've already talked about the 1 year's growth goals that we saw work well at the elementary, that being brought up to the secondary level as well as that use of data in real time and the goal setting and action planning that we're doing there as well.
So we move on to the graduate profile. You can see that we have really hitting the bar on a lot of these components. I'm only just going to touch on this briefly. Danielle is going to go on it in much more detail in her own presentation, so I don't want you to have to listen to me say the same thing twice. But moving into 58.1% for compete at the high school, 91.5 of commit, really all those numbers very high and looking really well, especially in a year they're expanding the use of the graduate profile with COVID going on. So really moving into some good trends there to fully complete the graduate profile at each building. And then the state report cards. So the Pewaukee School District, Horizon School, and the high school all received a significantly exceeds expectations on their state report card. Asa Clark Middle School received exceeds expectations. And then Pewaukee Lake Elementary has a different report card this year. This is the first year they have it. Because they don't have a testing grade on the forward, they can't use any assessment data. And so they have what's called an alternative report card. There are two options. Either you are not making satisfactory progress or you are making satisfactory progress. Pewaukee Lake Elementary is making satisfactory progress on their goals.
We feel bad for PLE because it looks kind of sad, but we have no other options for them. And the report card itself, as if you did look at it at all, is also quite sad because there's very little data on it. We're not entirely sure why, honestly, they even get a report card with what it is that they gave us back, but it is what it is.
1 point though for the Pewaukee Lake Elementary report card is that while the students do not have to take the forward or do anything, Mr. Siegel does have to do much more work and prepare and help write the goal statements and monitor the goal statements and then submit all of the information to DPI. So much more work for him to do that now. Very important. So just as a quick comparison for the Wisconsin state report cards, there were 19 districts in the state that received significantly exceeds expectations. Pewaukee was tied at 9th place with 2 other districts. So performing very, very well compared to other districts throughout the state. The 20th district was Iowa Grant, and they had already gone down to exceeds expectations. So really, really high rankings there.
Yeah, so just a couple of things to note on the report cards here, right? So this ranking that you see here, obviously these are K-12 districts. Certainly there's some other configurations of districts that are K-8 or you know, 9, 12 districts or something like that, that may have received significantly exceeds expectations rankings as well, but we want to compare ourselves to those that we most look similar to. So being in the top 10 in the state, I think, is a great thing for us to celebrate. It is important to note, and I know I sent this when I sent you all a note about the report cards, but that the score tabulation is altogether different than it was in previous years. So to go back and compare to previous scores that we've had is not appropriate, because they're calculated altogether differently. And so we're able to take where we're at here, and then we'll be able to compare in future years to this. But we're obviously happy with multiple schools, and as a district being in that significantly exceeds expectations. If I'm correct, Mike or Candace, correct me, I think this is the second or third time as a district. Second time as a district we're in significantly exceeds, and so pleased with those results. The report cards do break down different things, as I'm sure you may have looked at. It looks at our target group, which is our lowest 25% group. That's a new a new kind of report inside of the report card, which we're able then to analyze. It also shows our overall growth and value add differently than it previously did, to some degree. I don't know, Candace, if you can explain it any better than I can.
Value added or the changes?
The changes.
Okay. So in each of the categories, they are now doing strict scores that are adding together instead of averaging. The value added score, that is where it comes in. That is not a new component. However, that pulls in the same component. The biggest change occurs in the target groups. So we used to have these gap groups where we would look at different minority populations, be that special education, economically disadvantaged, a racial minority, and they would be compared to the non-minority group in the state. That is no longer how that score is calculated. It is now calculated by looking at the performance of the lowest 25% of your students and comparing their performance to the highest 75% of your students. They compare that based on proficiency, growth, their college and career readiness, and then there's a fourth one. I'm freezing. I'll think of it in a minute. Anyway, it's basically their own little mini report card. The next part, which was a really, really nice change, is that student absentee data, while it has never been technically a personal problem for us, if there was a problem, you had 5 points just chopped off the top of your score. That is now taken into your college and career readiness score. And so it's kind of a little bit of a booster for a lot of districts where students are regularly attending, and you're not getting nothing or 5 points chopped off.
Yeah, so overall, we expected the report cards to come out the way that we did. Report cards are hard for us to utilize in that we don't even see them until October usually. We get then a 2-week period to basically double check all of the math and let DPI know if we see any errors that need correcting. And then, of course, they're not disembargoed for public consumption until, in this case, it was just last week, right, November 16th. So it's awfully late in the year then to be action planning around that. So the good news is that because we have somebody like Candace on staff who does so much data analysis for us, we already anticipated what it is. There was nothing that surprised us on the report cards. We had already set up action plans. All of those action plans remain the same, so nothing we saw there changed. However, Candace and I did meet with every principal team at each school to go through line by line the report card to make sure that they understood what it was that we were seeing, and to make sure that they had clarity on all of that, and just to confirm again that the steps that we had already put in place this summer based on what we had seen from other data sources was what we needed to continue to do to make progress on things. But overall, we were pleased with the report cards.
And I do apologize. The one other big change that we were really excited about was that instead of a 6-year graduation rate, they're now including a 7-year graduation rate. And so previously, when we had students in our 18 to 21-year-old program and we're providing them support, they were considered non-graduates in that 6-year graduation rate if they didn't slip into that 6th year. So if they went into an additional 7 years, they weren't counted as graduating, and so now they are, which is very exciting.
So we were penalized for kids having late birthdays and not turning 21 until late into their schooling, which really made no sense. So we were happy that that changed.
So for the 21-22 assessment school year calendar, students will be taking STAR. Students in RTI will be taking it as progress monitoring, and it is used as screening in grades 4K through 8. The COGAT talented and gifted screening is done in grades 3 and 5. The pre-ACT was done this fall in grades 9 and 10. The summative ACT Aspire is the spring, 9-10, that is their state test. Access for ELL is in winter. Forward Dynamic Learning Maths and the pre-ACT are all coming up in spring as well. And are there any questions?
Danielle, I have a question for you. With respect to the 8th grade math, how does our curriculum compare to those other districts that are higher performing on those tests?
Yeah, so we've identified some, we had identified some gaps in the curriculum, which is, we've made changes to at this point, but again, they haven't been as deeply embedded yet because we're only 1 year into those and stuff. And so one of the, I'm trying to think back as to what some of the biggest pieces were, but a lot of the pieces were around like math fluency, and that other districts had some pieces around fluency that were stronger than ours, that we've been learning from, as well as, again, those topics in isolation, like geometry for a long time was an area that we simply just didn't hit as strongly as we needed to. Candace, can you think off the top of your head of any other categories we would see consistently low in math?
Geometry was just one of the
Geometry
really
was the
big
one that
ones
really
that we
stood
would
out
see
and stuff that we just didn't have enough of scaffold throughout all of the elementary and middle school years.
And fractions.
And fractions, yeah.
Okay. And then the other one, when was the curriculum changed for high school? The math curriculum.
The math, all of the K-12 curriculum was changed last year. So so the 2021 school year was the first year of implementation. The math, though, at the high school changed to an integrated model. So instead of algebra, geometry, algebra 2, which is the typical sequence, it's now math 1, math 2, math 3, and those concepts are all integrated together, again, to be able to scaffold and build off each other. But we're grandfathering in, right? Because if a student took algebra, we can't put them in math 2 because half of math 2 is going to be the algebra concepts they already learned, and then they're not going to get enough of the geometry that they would get in math 1. So so we have to grandfather it in over the course of 3 years.
Okay, just because when I was looking at those numbers, the 17 and 18 and 18 and 19 numbers for math were here, and then the 20 and 21 were down here. So, you know, I guess, you know, when you talked about like the English and science, you're like, hey, we're seeing great test scores. There's no reason to change that. So when the math scores were higher, what drove that to say, hey, we need to change that because now we're seeing a 2-year trend down? Yeah,
and while they were a little bit higher, I would say they still were, you know, if we look at that, like they're still pretty low. And so that's what drove the change. It's fairly typical actually when we implement a new curriculum that we see what we call an implementation dip, right? Kind of true in most anything that you do. We were very pleased with the elementary that it went so smoothly, so quickly. Honestly, what we see a little bit in the middle school is what you would almost expect a bit more sometimes when you start a new curriculum, because there are disruptions to it, that teachers are moving through the new curriculum, but then they don't realize that there's a gap that students had from the previous curriculum, and they aren't able to as quickly kind of come back and shore that up, which is why we put in that foundational skills assessment this year. That's the piece that is helping teachers better identify what are the skill gaps that kids are coming to them with that they need to both fix that as well as keep moving forward in the new curriculum. So that was a piece that we learned last year. The other piece, again, I will reiterate, to be fair to the middle school is that while, again, we're not going to use COVID as a crutch for any means, because all of our schools in our county were in the same boat as us, but of our 4 schools, it was the most disrupted school throughout the school year.
The other comment I would just make, Eric, is that that 17-18 group that was in 8th grade, 17-18, has been historically a higher performing cohort. So you see a little bit of is that fair to say, Candace, that's our current juniors, right? They've generally been a stronger performing cohort.
They've
Yeah.
been typically pretty average.
Pretty average.
Because they should be the class of 2023, right? Because I was trying to go back.
They're the class of 23.
Yeah, they've been, generally speaking, fairly average-ish. Maybe on the higher end of average, not on the lower end of average. Part of what does get conflated when you look at their comparables is right before them, their grad years are the 2019 and 2021. Relative to 2021, they are much better. Relative to 2019, who just loved math was their favorite, they are a little bit lower. So
Yeah, that's why, I think it's what you were saying, Mike, is that ACT test of 2017-18, that was the grads of 2019, and those kids were setting the curve the whole way up.
Yeah, they were really high.
The whole, from elementary school all the way through.
Yep.
Yeah, I will say one of the other pieces that we know is true at the middle school comparison to the elementary specific in math is, while I commented on, it was interesting that we learned, right, that we very successfully got through all of the curriculum without bumps at the elementary. That was not true at the middle school, and we did not get through all of the curriculum at the middle school last year due to the bumps that they had in the road. And so, again, that's also not uncommon with new curriculum, but is a piece that we are very, very mindful of this year as we're working to shore that up.
Okay, and then I have one other question. So with the reconfiguration of the middle school, did that show any impact on testing at all?
Candace, any thoughts on the grade reconfiguration?
I wouldn't say they had anything specific to proficiency and testing. Anthony might be able to speak to the, testing environment or things like that, but it is speaking towards proficiency itself.
Yeah.
And he came up really fast, so I think he does.
Can I interject for a second?
Absolutely.
If you recall the old middle school model and the old middle school schedule, we ran a 5x5 block, which did not allow teams of teachers the opportunity to have a common prep and a common planning time. Since implementing the new structure and the new schedule, one of our goals 3 years back was to get teams of teachers together to review student data and to adjust instructional strategies based on how the students were performing. So with our new schedule and our new structure, that allows that to occur. Now, last year, due to the way that the year went, our academic PLCs did not function. So we did, the first year of the new structure, took a step back last year, and then this year are doing so again with regards to looking at data on a weekly basis and informing our instructional. So I would say the new structure allows us to better do that than the old.
Yeah, I just want to give a lot of credit to the staff at ASA, that when they saw the data this summer that nobody loved what we saw, they immediately went into problem solving mode. They took ownership of what they felt like, they took ownership of the data and said, we can do better, and have been very positive and very collaborative with myself, with Anthony and Katie, and Robin throughout all of this. And so, I just want to say hats off to them for, owning and recognizing what it is that they needed to own and recognize, and being very active in working the problem, right? And working towards a solution.
Thank you.
Questions? Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Candace.
And yes, huge shout out to Candace for all that she does
Thank you very much.
in constantly answering our questions about data and for being here
Yes.
and coming across country for it.
Of course.
So.
Have a wonderful evening.
There are better times to come to Wisconsin.
Yes.
Goodbye
Okay.
to our student reps. Good night.
Yes, good night.
Good
Good
night.
night.
Guys.
So
We're
here's where
about
you
to-
should all infuse some caffeine. 'cause we're
Yeah,
halfway
I was just gonna
through.
suggest maybe we take a 5-minute stretch break. How people feel about that?
Sounds great.
All right.
that will be me. Brian
Alright.
is going to be my clicker for me, and stuff, so that we can, that I can stay here and our principals can use the podium and stuff. So, yeah, so we have our continuous improvement reports for teaching and learning and for the school. I'm going to talk very briefly because you've been hearing me talk for a really long time now, and the principals are really going to go into much greater detail and stuff. So I don't know, Mike, if you have any opening comments.
Yeah, I mean, we, last meeting you heard from the other 5 departments. We always pair teaching and learning with the school reports. And Stacy asked a great question. Why do we do all this in one night? Because it's a very long meeting. This meeting always is a marathon. The reason and the feedback we've had in the past is that it's helpful for you as board members to hear the overall data performance view and the school reports at the same time, and certainly teaching and learning fits with the schools. So it's just a lot of information in one night, but it is a key component of our continuous improvement cycle with these several meetings where you get kind of the achievement reports and the reports on how we've done with strategic goals. So with that, the last department for you to hear from after the 5 you heard from last time is teaching and learning. I'll turn it over to Danielle.
All right, Brian, if you can advance, actually 2 slides will be fine, because Mike just talked through that one. Yeah, so from a teaching and learning standpoint, and Brian, you can move to the next one. The last 3 years, our strategic goals have been 2 parts, a future ready goal and a personalized learning goal. The future ready goal maintains in this new strategic plan, but this is the old goal, and the new one is similar, but a bit different. And so the goal of the Future Ready one in this last strategic plan was to really get that implementation of our Future Ready competencies as measured by our graduate profile indicators into each school, and really in full implementation. As you recall, we developed the graduate profile through the last strategic plan, and so it's really about now that we have it, we've implemented it. Now in this next strategic plan, it'll be how are we doing with it? And then from a personalized learning standpoint was making sure that all of our classrooms are creating learning environments that are personalized to student learning, as we defined with our PSD personalized learning guiding principles, which are what are on the left there of that image. And we monitored that through our classroom observations, as well as a self-reflection tool. And if you go to the next one, Brian. So here are our results from this last strategic planning go round. We asked our staff to do some self-reflection on where they believe they were on each of these personalized learning guidelines based on the definition of these, and those definitions come from the research around these 6 guidelines. So these were on a 5-point scale. We set goals around these initial scores based on the goal setting that Studer does with us as far as how much they should grow. I'm happy to report that all of them exceeded the goals that we initially set. Not a surprise that Digitally Rich Tech Infused made a pretty nice jump, much like Rachel it kind of mentioned 2 weeks ago. Some of our strategic plan goals were met because of the pandemic, which, we saw some growth in some areas. A few other highlights to note around personalized learning. Over the course of the last 3 years strategic plan, just in the summer alone, our staff completed over 12,500 hours of professional development. So that's actually about 5 summers worth of professional learning in 3. And so all of that additional time was all voluntary extra time that our staff put in because they wanted to continue to improve their craft. And we also know that the personalized learning guidelines, particularly being standards-based, the digital component was huge during the pandemic. Our flexibility with structures and spaces, I am confident that in particular in spring of 2020, but throughout what we've been all working through the last 18, 20 months, has been successful because of our personalized learning strategies. And when I hear other districts talking about, adding Canvas for the first time or changing to standards-based grading for the first time in the midst of this pandemic, I just can't imagine. And so we've been very fortunate that those were strategies we already had in place. And then from a graduate profile standpoint, I'm not going to spend much time on this because the principals are all going to break this down for you in much greater detail. But happy to report that we have successfully implemented all of the competencies in all of our schools and have had growth in nearly every single one of them. A couple of them got disrupted because of the nature of our schedules and structure last year, but still a ton of progress. So this is the progress that was made just in last year alone. You can see that on the left of those columns in the 1920 school year, we had either some that hadn't been implemented fully as we measure them by, again, that doesn't mean that, you know, we weren't caring for kids or something like that, but it was how we were measuring that particular indicator. And some we made huge gains on once we were able to put the structures in place that we wanted to for those competencies. And the principals are really going to break that down in much greater detail. So if we go to the overall successes from teaching and learning, again, all the competencies are in implementation. We saw growth occurring in those measurement tools. Over the last 3 years, we had a successful transition of grade level realignment. If you recall, you know, going into the grade level realignment, we had over 40 courses at the middle school and high school that we had to adjust because the curriculum for because of that grade realignment. So to adjust 40 courses, of which 3 months got chopped off because of the pandemic, is no small feat. And then this is a note that doesn't appear very directly in the graduate profile, but it's something we're watching closely. It's because we have a goal around this, is that we want to have all of our students have a professional mentor an individual professional mentor in their high school career. So in 5 years, when we started with mentors, which was started in the Insight program, 6% of our graduates back in 2016 had an individual professional mentor. Last year, the class of 2021, 32% of them had experienced an individual mentor. We already know that the class of 2022 is on track to have 46% of them have an individual professional mentor, and we have plans in place for that to continue to grow. So that's an exciting data mark that we have as well, is that more and more students are experiencing the power of having a professional adult in their lives who's not their parents and not their teachers, guiding them to success in the future. And then when we look at our opportunities for improvement, you know, we just spent more than an hour taking a look at our academic data, and you know, we want to continue and improve our academic excellence. I do believe that we have academic excellence in this district. There's always areas for improvement. We outlined those tonight. We are continuing to refine and improve our assessment practices. That had been a multi-year goal that we had. It had to take a bit of a pause last year. We're back at that aggressively this year. Improving assessment practices to be more authentic and relevant to students. I think you saw a great example of that tonight in our Spotlight on Learning, on a way that you can measure math in a different way that's far more relevant and authentic for students. And we've identified growth goals in each of the graduate profile competencies in each school over the next 3 years. So that will be our primary tool that will measure how we continue to grow in these competencies. We continue to infuse the graduate profile in our programs and processes. So while tonight we're specifically talking about those school-wide indicators, those school-wide measurements, again, tonight you saw the example of how our teachers have taken that, and students are doing self-reflections using the graduate profile. I think it's language that our students talk now and can speak to how they're performing on the graduate profile, but we want to continue to explore how at the student level those competencies can really be kind of measured and how they can look. So we continue to explore that as well. So before I turn it over to Brian, any questions for me?
Anyone? Thank you.
All right. So for PLE, even though based on the state saying that we are satisfactory, we really think that we're doing a really, really nice job. So hopefully highlight some of those things that we try to put into our report. They'll show that we're a little bit more than satisfactory. So this past year, we had a strategic goal to focus on math with the new Bridges program to increase the way that students are able to compete within the math area. And you can see there, with each grade level, we had very specific targeted standards that we wanted to focus on with kids. So here, I know it's a lot of numbers and everything, but you can see here that in nearly each standard with each grade level, we were able to hit our target. If we weren't able to hit our target, you can see kind of our percentage growth of proficiency in each of those areas. Huge credit to our math coaches and our teachers in their first year of implementing Bridges. If you were to see it in action, it's a ton of prep, a lot of reading curriculum, pages and pages to get ready for lessons. So a huge shout out to all of them for all the work that they did to hit not only these targets, sometimes surpassing them, but no matter what, making huge growth in student proficiency. For the first year, and it'll be a little bit different when you look at data from our current year, but because we didn't use Bridges before, the baseline was using the previous year's standards, and then the final data, their progress was using their actual grade level data. So it was using slightly different standards, and even with that, you saw a huge amount of growth there. This year, we're going to be using their actual grade level standards in the beginning and at the end of the year. So overall successes for us, when we looked at employee engagement, we saw some really nice growth in two key areas. One was demonstrating genuine concern for staff, and given the amount of stress that people were going through last year, this is something that we really, really wanted to focus on. We hang our hat on that we want our staff to feel cared about and taken care of despite everything else going on. And then when we broke down other pieces to it with both our certified teachers as well as paraprofessionals, we saw an increased rating of how they felt about our school, increased feeling of their talents feeling supported, overall increase in job satisfaction, both among certified staff and paraprofessionals, and then paras feeling comfortable bringing their thoughts and opinions forward, which hadn't always been the case at our school, given the large number of paraprofessionals, and a lot of them being just a few hours a day. So opportunity for improvement, we saw that there's high turnover with our paraprofessionals. We can't offer a huge number of hours to them, but if we really value their talents and make best use of their time, we feel like we can retain them, and they're so important to the programs that we run. So we want to make sure that we are retaining our paraprofessionals, so that we're not going through a lot of hiring and a lot of onboarding each and every year. For Bridges, and we're going to get to this in a second, you'll see a huge decrease in our compete math data. With Dreambox, we're trying to find a way to marry both the Bridges curriculum and Dreambox together. I'll get to that in just a second. And then this year, we're really focusing on using informal assessment practices to drive our instruction, not always waiting for that summative assessment to say, all right, what do we need to do, but doing more learning sprints like Horizon has done in the past, and that's what we're really working on during our professional development days this year. So for our grad profile, you can see with Contribute, really high numbers there. Each grade level was doing a service project each quarter. They had different scopes of impact, whether it's in their classroom, grade level, school, or beyond the Pewaukee community. Really nice participation there. And if you take into account, we had at least one section virtual at each grade level. Even the kids in the virtual setting were doing some sort of contributing piece to other people there. With Create, again, we saw a huge jump here. If you look in the actual full CIR report, in there I do note what last year's percentages were, so you can see growth year to year, but just to save on space, I didn't do that here. We had a challenge with 4K, 4Kers being a bit independent, doing design thinking at home, but we're very confident that we're going to get that number up now that we have all 4K back. In Compete, you'll see that we really knocked out of the park with literacy, but then in math, especially at first grade, where our compete goal was focused around Dreambox. We had really, really good Dreambox data when we were all virtual the year before, because that was the main tool that everyone was using. But now that we are in Bridges, we were focusing on building up the workplaces and developing the curriculum, and that was then the common piece together. So Dreambox kind of took a side seat so that we could really develop and dig into Bridges. So now our goal is how do we marry the two together? This year we're turning our goal away from Dreambox to Bridges, so we can use a Bridges assessment, which is what we're using then to drive our math instruction week to week, unit to unit. Prior to getting Bridges, we had a lot of resources, but Dreambox was that one constant between every classroom. Now that we've got Bridges, that's the constant that we're going to be really hanging our hat on, of are we using that to plan our math instruction. So look for that data to really change as we head into next year.
And you'll see that a couple of times in the buildings. One of the things we knew when we implemented the measurement tools for these competencies is that sometimes, you know, best laid plans, you start to use a measurement tool and you realize that's not really measuring what we want it to measure. It's not really doing what we need it to do and tell us information. And let's not just keep doing it for the sake of doing it. Let's make sure that we're actually getting the indicator right. So there's a couple of tweaks that you'll see. And again, we've now set those 3-year growth goals. So each year we have growth goals based on any kind of adjustments we made. So you'll hear each of the principals potentially mention something that got tweaked a little bit. And that was the whole purpose of this last kind of round of strategic planning.
And Dreambox was a good measurement tool, but it didn't drive instruction. So when we look at what goals are we looking at, what data are we looking at, we wanted something that drove our instruction forward, which we believe will be Bridges, not so much Dreambox. But it'll be another good indicator of our kids making progress. For Connect, I won't go into all these numbers, but we saw nice increases. Where we did see a little bit of dips were with staff connections and peer connections among those students who were in the virtual setting. Not huge amounts, but that's kind of where that data was reflected, was with those kids who are either virtual for part of the year or the whole year. And then for Commit, that's setting personal goals. For our youngest students, that was setting goals as a whole classroom, whether it's around work habits or how they treat each other, kind of friendship goals, social goals, and then doing some reflection afterwards about how the goals impacted themselves and others. And then for Care, we implemented 5K through 2nd grade, a weekly care survey of how kids are doing, asking them what their mood was. For some grades, they asked, did you have breakfast? Did you sleep well? Just so that we knew how to respond to kids when they were coming into school each day. We were tweaking it for 4K. This year, we're finally implementing a care survey for 4K, so you'll see different numbers at this time next year. So other highlights for students, we navigated a full year with COVID. In between the in-person and virtual learning, and a number of classrooms transitioned from being virtual to in-person, and we constantly had kids moving from virtual to in-person and getting them acclimated to being in school again. And for staff, we got our 4K program up and running. It's running full steam ahead this year. Our staff did a great job in both the virtual setting, virtual Wednesdays, and then transitioning kids in person. And we're really working hard at embedding coding and technology into the curriculum, so it's not a standalone. They can see how it takes place as a part of what they're already doing. And if you've seen any of the stuff that's going on in the 4K rooms, you can see how all that is very much embedded in it. And then looking ahead for students, we're going to continue to work with design thinking and technology and how do we embed that into what they're doing. We're going to continue to expand our Makerspace program and fully utilize it. Last year with COVID, we couldn't use it to its full capacity, so now we're really moving ahead in how we can use it better. For staff, we're looking at improving observation and feedback system for our paraprofessionals so we can help them grow throughout the year and not just focus on certified staff, as well as utilizing learning sprints to help our certified teachers look at data more closely and how they can use that to target specific kids or specific groups to move them forward.
Any questions for Brian? Steve?
So I love the concept of contribute. Can fourth graders and all the way through second grade, can they articulate what that means to themselves and their community? Like, do they get a grasp of what that really is?
So the reflection questions are tailored to each grade level.
Yeah.
So at 4K, it was when you did it, how did it make you feel?
Yeah.
How do you think it made other people feel?
Ah.
That's kind of it.
Yeah.
Going up to second grade, then it's how did you feel?
Yeah.
How do you think it made other people feel? I'm trying to think what else. Oh yeah, how did you make? How do you feel like you made a difference in their life? So really trying to put themselves in other people's shoes and
Yeah.
see what kind of impact it is. So the reflection pieces are kind of scaled up with it. This year, the big change is we're asking all classroom teachers to pose those questions as discussion during their morning meetings so that they're talking about it and the teacher can kind of elaborate on student answers and really push their thinking about their impact on others.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for addressing that.
Brian, how did the 4K transition to kindergarten this year after their experimental year as the?
So one issue that we are trying to figure out this year is that we're noticing a bit of an academic divide between those kids who went through our 4K program and those who did not. So we're very, very proud of the data that we're getting from those kids who did our 4K program, but it's creating a bit of a discrepancy between those who were either at home before or did a different preschool program. I mean, it's not it's not a huge gap, but there's a noticeable difference between letter ID, letter sounds, identifying lowercase and uppercase letters, being able to subtize or identify numbers or sets of numbers, very quickly. Being able to mentally add and subtract small numbers. I feel very good about what our program is offering, but now we're tasked with the challenge of, because 4K provides maybe like 75% of the kids in 5K, how we make up that gap with people who don't go through our 4K program. So I guess it's a good problem to have.
Do you have a sense, what percentage is that of the students in 5K then?
Off the top of my head, I'd say like 75%, 80% of our
About 80%.
4K program make up our
That went
5K.
through.
Yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, 75, 80%.
It would typically, this year it's going to be a little bit lower because the biggest drop off that we saw was in our 4K program last year. But normally it's going to be about 75 to 80% of our 4Kers make up our 5K population.
And you saw that in Candace's enrollment numbers, that student I think you said we bounced back up maybe 20-ish students this year. That was largely returning to the 4K, and turning that enrollment that we lost last year.
Yeah, a lot of 4Kers had selected to stay at home or stay with their daycare program that they were before instead of coming to school last year.
Other questions? Awesome, thank you.
All right, turn it over to Pete.
Thanks for staying here so long.
My pleasure.
I was gonna thank you guys for hanging in there too, so.
Thanks.
I'm working off notes because I can't see those screens, so if I'm looking down a little bit, that's what I'm doing. And
Yeah,
I've
one to
got-
your right you
turn-
can look
turn
at
your
too.
right there. Oh, that's awkward, okay. So, again, thanks for hanging in there with us tonight. I will do my best to use my small amount of time wisely. The last few years, we've had a motto to start our year. It's every kid, every day, everybody. We wear it on our t-shirts, something we put in our weeklies. We do activities, we reflect on it. Last year, we decided to change that for 1 year only. It was together, whatever. When I usually put this presentation together, I've done it a couple of times now, I take a new photograph of Horizon School. Last year was a really beautiful sunrise. I've taken pictures of rainbows over the building and the Horizon Hawk floating over the building. One of the coolest ones was Horizon in the dark of night, completely lit up from the inside. This year, as I was thinking about talking about our group tonight, I realized it's much more about the people inside the building than the building itself. What you're seeing is a photograph of us, a victory photograph of us on the very last day of school. Everybody who helped contribute to our success last year gathered It was a very hopeful time because we felt like we had a very successful year. We were able to really kind of talk about all the challenges that we faced and how we overcame those, and had a great year supporting each other and supporting our kids. Our strategic goals haven't changed much in the last couple of years. We're still really pushing on that 1 year's growth. The number may change a little bit. Same thing with, you've heard a lot about the graduate profile. For us, it was kind of the basics of making sure that all students had access to activities related to the graduate profile. The challenge wasn't the goals. The challenge was trying to meet the goals with kids moving in and out of quarantine. Over 150 students never stepped foot in the building. They worked from home for just about the entire year last year.
Wow.
So trying to hit those goals with those students was a challenge, as well as the academic goals. So those were the things we worked on. Teachers did an incredible job of finding ways to connect with kids, to have the kids connect with each other, and connect with the curriculum and the concepts that we were teaching. So those were some of again, the goals didn't change much, but the path to the goals, I think, was different. Some of the things that we felt successful about, that third grade team finally made it over to our building. We've been talking about that for a long time. Kind of had that year where half of them were there. I think it was good for our building to have those, a new batch of really strong teachers, really strong personalities, and those tiny little kids to join us. Helped us redefine ourselves as an elementary school, and I think that's where our identity fits well for us. We heard a lot about bridges tonight. We've been experimenting with it for a while. It's a great curriculum. It's a great program. Number Corner is incredible. None of that happens without teachers who are really excited about it. So there was a lot of buy-in for that last year. AVMR is another piece we haven't talked about much. I think full implementation of that, full training of that for teachers to be able to diagnose and do interventions in math in the classroom on their own was really a big piece. Instead of leaning on our incredible team of coaches and interventionists quite so much. Talked about the forward assessment for math. It was really a great year for us. The challenge, of course, becomes to, how do we continue to have those charts look the way they do, where they keep moving up. Teachers made really creative use. I think out of kind of desperation comes inspiration sometimes. Teachers made a really great use of some of the resources that were intended for one use. And a really good example is Danielle suggested that Brian and I spend some money on Teachers College lessons that we could share with kids if we were home for extended periods of time. That would maybe supplement what we would do with our reading. We hardly use them for that purpose at all. What teachers decided to do was take those, kind of build their own professional development plans, or mini professional development plans. They would watch those videos, kind of use them as mentors, make adjustments, and then teach those videos with their students. Talked a lot about Mike and Danielle. A lot of that was embedded in the professional development plan, so a lot of the feedback we gave to them was based on their progress through that set of videos. So there was some really kind of cool use of that. Opportunities for improvement. This isn't a typo. The top one says, welcome to third grade team. Some of the elements of them joining us went really well. Some of them we really need to work on.
You need to advance this for us. There we go.
There it is. Oh, here's the joke. That's not a typo. It's much funnier now. So one thing we didn't do very well for those guys was integrate them into the building. And we can blame it on COVID, and we can say that the collaborative possibilities outside of their small groups, due to mitigation, due to trying to really limit contacts. But those folks, as a really strong team, they were really tight to each other, didn't do a great job of making sure that they had opportunities to kind of learn from the other people in the building. Makerspace, unfortunately, really, again, it's a small area. Everything in there is going to get touched. So we were really nervous about using some of those areas. So we didn't use Makerspace much. Really impacted our coding, really impacted our opportunity for kids to use the robots. Again, you'll see some of those things in a minute when we talk about things to improve on. Lack of community events, some of the things that really define us. We had to do it again this year, but our Veterans Day program, Amy Berudian's Morning Larks program, those types of things that I feel help us build our identity over the years. We didn't do any of those last year. So we came up with some virtual solutions, but it really wasn't the same experience for our staff and kids. I think one more thing that I didn't mention is the kids learning from home, those 150 kids that we actually didn't see in the building. I don't think we did a very good job of making sure that they had, we didn't use their voice and choice when it came to implementing some of the pieces of the graduate profile for them. So I think their experience, that was something that was missing as they worked from home. Okay. We did do some, I love talking to Danielle about this, because if it wasn't for Danielle, I'd have a really hard time pulling some of these things off. Always really good ideas and always lots of inspiration from Danielle. We were able to do some contributions, and we were able to do service projects. So those numbers reflect that. What they don't reflect is the students able to kind of think about the experience and reflect on it and do some building on that. That's something that we didn't do that we had planned to do last year. The presentations that our students use to kind of talk about their growth, talk about their year, talk about some of the things that they were excited about. We did make the presentations, but we didn't build in enough opportunities for the kids to actually share the presentations with a wider audience. Talked a lot about compete. We feel really good about the scores on things like our F&P scores were really great last year. Lots of kids met their proficiencies. We talked a little bit about the forward. You can see the other scores there. I can't see them from here, but hopefully you guys can. We did get close to those numbers, but those are some things that we have to work on too. Again, it kind of comes down to the opportunities that we provide the kids. Connect was one that we had a little more trouble with. Connect for us meant connect to each other. We did find opportunities for kids to do that, but they were they weren't opportunities that the kids made. They were opportunities that we created. We kind of got near the end of the year, and we realized that we had missed a few things along the way. Some of the opportunities couldn't happen, so we pulled some things together at the end of the year. CARE was a big piece for us. It was about the middle of the year in January. Thank you. Got it? CARE was, we were kind of talking about managing what we were going to ask teachers to do. The plate's this big, plate was full. The idea of dropping one more thing on the plate in the middle of the year was something we decided to manage. So we waited until the last quarter. So the CARE numbers that you see there are kids who were working through the survey that Brian was talking about, customized for each grade level, and then kind of reflecting on their scores over time. While we weren't able to do that all year, we were able to do that very consistently over that last 9 weeks. Other highlights. So that picture, I hope you guys can see that. That wasn't a posed photograph, and it wasn't a one-time situation. We were able to kind of use our building and our grounds in a completely different way. Mrs. Barudian moved outside, you guys, for the entire first quarter, all day, every day. Wow. She did it because we thought kids would feel safer outside. We were able to spread kids out. They were able to sing without their masks on. So her classroom transitioned. You can see she's got some support there from Mrs. Apold, but we were able to give her the tools to do that, and she really kind of led the way, so other people started to use the outside areas as well. So again, kind of from those tribulations come sometimes some things to be really excited about. Our kids did experience some tribes activities, and it really turned into some cool mentoring sessions, some cooperative games, and there's some art projects that we were able to pull together. You can't have a great building without great teachers. We're really excited that Katie Adams is one of those, and we're excited that she was able to be a Cole Award winner last year. Moving forward, many of the things you see there, even though they're not all categorized that way, a project that we've been working on as a team for a little while, and we're really emphasizing it now, is talking about student behavior as a way to get students ready to do the things that we need them to do. A lot of student behavior happens when they're not ready, when they're not comfortable, and when they're not in the correct situation. So that's what a lot of this is focusing on. Our student success team is working diligently. We've come up with a behavior matrix that we're starting to pilot, and a big piece of that is weaving in parts of the graduate profile. So there's more of a systematic approach to pull those two things together. We are really excited to get back in the maker space, and that space is open all the time now. Kind of got over the idea that this was touched a half an hour ago and nobody can touch it So those robots are back in use, the coding activities are back in use. Last year we actually put some things on carts, but again, we were kind of nervous about having things checked in and out, and we're supposed to wait 3 days. So those carts are back in use too, so we're excited about that. Collaborative partnerships beyond kind of what we talked about with the 3rd grade. All of our teachers this year built in a second collaborative partnership, maybe a partnership they've never used before. They actually put that right into their PLP, something that they felt passionate about, that they wanted to be held accountable for. They're excited to plan with other people, learn from other people, and all of those relationships also take, there's a component that requires them to do observations, kind of act as mentors for each other. Horizon Fest is going to happen this spring, COVID or not. It's an activity that we're going to do outside, and it's going to be a 3-day music festival, like think Summerfest, but behind Horizon. So we're really excited to pull that off. We got big plans for stages. It's not just a comeback for all the activities we lost last year. It's going to weave lots of things together. It's going to be a really cool opportunity for kids to share their skills, but also for the entire community to come and see how great our kids are, and to watch them in action. They're going to show the arts. They're going to sing. Student bands are starting to form, so I don't know how we're going to figure out how to manage all that, but it's going to be great.
Some of this without the beer, right?
But yeah, and if we were serving beer, it'd be $12 a glass. So. Okay, you guys have questions for us?
Any questions for Pete?
No, make sure you let us know when that Horizon Fest happens.
Yeah.
Well, we're planning it for the last week of June, so.
The middle of the day, end of the day, what?
We're going to do it after school. It's going to be 1 grade level per night. And so we're going to have all the stages and everything set up. It's guided by our Miss Bruni, and the Encore team are pulling all these things together. They kind of asked, what can't we do? And I haven't said no to anything yet. So probably should get it checked with you guys. But it's going to be really great.
It's news to me.
First I've heard of it.
I guess we're having a Horizon Fest next summer.
I thought they had the big pond out there.
Thanks, Pete. All right. Anthony, you're up.
Would someone be so kind to?
Yes. Pete is, he's your slide advancer.
All right, so I'm gonna hop right into our strategic goal from last year. We had set this same goal 2 years ago, but due to school closing down in the spring, never got to see it to fruition. So really didn't know what our baseline would be. And I know I had shared in the information that was pushed out ahead of time a little bit about our compete goal. It's specifically aligned with literacy in our building and students reaching their individual growth goals. So each student had an individual growth goal in 4 different identified assessments. Those assessments really being their arts course proficiency related to some specific standards, their social studies course proficiency related to some specific standards, same with science. And those specific standards were related to literacy. And then we also use the STAR assessment for students. As Candace had kind of mentioned a little bit in her presentation, when the students take their first STAR assessment in October, based on that baseline test, it identifies a individualized goal for them as to what they should reach by the end of the year. So we had this in place 2 years ago and did not get a chance to see it through. We did fall short of our goal, but I think we learned a lot. You can see on the slide, Peter, are you on the second slide?
Yes.
Okay. You can see on that slide the breakdown of the percentage of students who met 0 of the measures all the way up to all 4 of the assessment measures. So we didn't reach our goal. Our success was really students reaching expectations out of those 4 identified assessments. But you can see students, there were a lot of students that met 2 or more. There were students that met 3 or more. There were students that met all 4 measures as well. Moving on to the next slide. So really looking at those results, what did we learn from that? I think first and foremost, like we want to continue our focus with literacy skills at the middle school. We have worked very hard to infuse literacy in all of the content areas. So we've made some changes for this year with regards to some additional standards that staff will be focusing on in all the core content areas related to literacy. Really not knowing what the full effects of the learning gaps that existed as a result of COVID. We decided last year to set an ambitious goal. We're going to continue to do that this year. Specific to the one action step that I think probably has the ability to allow us to achieve our goals the most is our ability to progress monitor using data. Last year, we had really, really good plans to have a data dashboard and to be able to review that dashboard on a quarterly basis. And that did not come to be because the team that we had put together to do that got caught up with managing contact tracing and doing a million different other things. It's really hard to set a goal and to reach a goal if in the course of your work, you don't know if what you're doing is working or not working. So you'll hear some of the things that we put in place this year to kind of respond to that. Some of our successes, and actually when Pete was presenting, I guess I totally forgot. Time flies. It seems like last year it was like 2 years of my life. But in addition to some of the successes that I have listed here that I'll get into, I forgot that last year was our first year of the new middle school structure and onboarding, a bunch of new staff members. But in addition to that, we did have some successes with student achievement. Our 8th grade students that took that pre-ACT, they did have some success there, and we had 76.4% of our students in reading, 81.3% of our students in English, and 80.3% of our students in math that were identified as proficient or higher on the pre-ACT. Our employee engagement scores continued to be very strong, with our highest score being that showing genuine concern for our staff members' welfare. Our average score for that was a 4.4 out of 5. And then our graduate profile implementation. So continuing with the focus from year to year on that and getting a little bit better. Opportunities for improvement. So I talked a little bit about that disciplinary literacy alignment. We had a lot of groups focusing on disciplinary literacy, but it was kind of scattered. I feel like this year everyone's kind of rowing the boat in the same direction. There's some connection between what those people are doing. The second piece is we are adding a strategic math goal into our strategic literacy goal that we had in place this year. So we will focus on individual growth in all of our students in the areas of literacy and math. And within that structure, we need to have the structure in place to be able to provide teachers the opportunity to review data, to learn data. The majority of our teachers in their teacher prep programs were never trained to analyze data and to go through that and set specific goals for students and to address teaching strategies. So there's a learning component with that as well. That's why I said we put this in place 2 years ago, and last year had to take a step back, but this is a process that we're committed to, and we think it's good. It's good for student learning. So building that process back in this year, we just allowed each of our core content teams, so math, language arts, science, and social studies, we subbed them out for a half a day, and we gave them, working with our instructional coaches, to really review the first quarter's data and do a couple different things. The first thing was to take a look at how all students were performing and to see if there were any adjustments that at the tier 1 level, so the instruction that all students get in the classroom, are there any adjustments? Do we have any gaps? Do we have any blind spots? That's step number 1. Step number 2 was really looking at all of the students' individual data and identifying the students that need some additional support and additional help and specific skills, putting a plan together on how to execute that, and then identifying those students that are showing that they're proficient and are showing that they need to be pushed forward, because it's those higher level kids that we need to push for growth with as well. So this came off the heels of that last week after quarter 1, and have those structures put in place to do some learning sprints between now and end of second quarter, and then we'll start the process over again. Second quarter, we'll get together, we'll look at that data. Graduate profile wise, had some celebrations this year. We kind of combine our contribute, create, and connect together in that students use the design thinking process to engage in a service learning activity that benefits either the school, local community, or the global community. And we met that goal. 100% of our students did that. Our compete goal is related to our strategic learning goal, which, like I said last year, was that focus on literacy. And like I talked before, we did not meet our measure for that goal. For commits, that is tied to students showing personal resiliency and initiative, and being able to talk about that at their end of the year academic and career planning conference. And we had 92% of our students held one of those conferences at the end of the year with their parents. And then our care measure is students developing a personalized plan to manage their own self-care. So in cooperation with our 2 school counselors and Adriana Plack, students on a weekly basis self-report on a personal care plan. We don't get that information. They're monitoring their own personal care and identifying coping skills that can help them along the way. So we had 100% of our students participate in that. Other highlights, like I said, successful implementation of the 6-8 house structure. All of our 6th grade students were trained in the makerspace equipment through the new STEAM Explore class. So that'll be something that all 6th graders, when they come into our building, they're required to take that class, and they kind of get that first taste of what's available to them in the makerspace. We were recognized by the Wisconsin RTI Center this year for our efforts with regards to math and reading intervention, and we are continuing with our professional development for our staff with regards to the collaborative problem-solving model, which is teams of teachers working together to support students' behavior, and then that design thinking process that you heard Brian Siegel talk a little bit about with, and that's something that we're hoping is in place from K-12 as students get the opportunity to work in that model. And then we had an in-person 8th grade promotion last year, so that was a success. Looking ahead, like I said, we are expanding our school goal with adding a strategic math goal. We will continue with our work on disciplinary literacy across content areas, continue with that design thinking process, and then I talked a little bit about implementation of structured data review processes with regards to student learning and student behavior in our building. All right, what questions do you have about middle school? Even if you want to go back to some of the things that Danielle talked about, feel free to ask.
Anyone?
Yeah, I have a question for you with regards to let's just say the math course proficiency of 70% that you have set.
Yeah.
How do special ed kids fit into that metric, I guess?
That's a good question. So it really depends on the student and what's in their IEP. When a student has accommodations listed in their IEP, those accommodations are meant for that student to be able to access that curriculum in the same manner that their same age peers would. So with those modifications, student would be able to have the same expectations as a regular peer. It would be the same proficiency scale that is used. If a student has specific modifications in their IEP, that's a modification to the general ed curriculum. So with regards to those students, there may be a little bit different curriculum or a different rubric that would be used, but they would still be measured in that proficiency would still apply to them as well. It just might look different for those students that have modifications written into their plan.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Anthony, can you speak just a little bit more to how you overcame the challenge from last year of losing the process for how you were going to do the data analysis? Like, what did you do differently this year to make sure that you didn't lose that opportunity again?
Well, I mean, I think that we, and there were things that happened last year with regards to, where our staff was, and I think we ultimately had to make a decision with certain things to take our foot off the gas pedal a little bit, kind of just hold that rock as opposed to pushing that rock up the hill. One of the things we stepped back on was the requirement that our team had to meet on a weekly basis on specific days that by coaches and administration to really look at student data and to be responsive to what the students needed. With regards to the overall structure, we had a pretty specific data dashboard that we wanted to have in place so that at the end of each quarter, our teachers and our building could determine, okay, are we on track to meeting our goal? Are we not on track? If we're not on track, what do we need to change to have a bigger impact? And that data dashboard simply was not able to be put together.
So how did you adapt so that this year you can do that? What would you do differently?
Well, Candace and I talk a lot. Candace has been helpful, and it's really having the same conversations that Katie, Candace, and I had 2 summers ago, and really putting some of those plans into action. We want to have usable data for our teachers to review at the end of each quarter so that they can really determine whether the instructional strategies that they're implementing in the classroom are having a positive effect on student learning. Because if they're not, it's time to find some new strategies.
One thing to keep in mind too with the middle and high school was that students were only here half the time until the end of first semester. And so when students were in person, we really had to make that decision of what is the most important thing for them to be doing while they're in person versus what can they accomplish when they're at home. And so the STAR assessment that we use, it is short, but it takes less than 30 minutes to administer. And so, we do that monthly. But, that kind of got kicked back to more like every 6 weeks to almost every 8 weeks because we only had those kids half the time in person. And when we had them, what were we going to do with them? And giving them more assessments for a while was not the best decision for us to make. And so we didn't have that data as regularly available as we do now. Now we have a very consistent calendar. We consistently are confident kids are here. So that played a role in it as well.
Okay, that better explains. Thanks.
Any other questions? Thank you, Anthony.
All right, Brian, you're the big close.
Pete, this is how this works. That's the high school. There's no more explanation about this picture. That's it. It's just the high school. My goal here, a long time. My goal here is to be succinct. I apologize. I'm going to hold this just because I'm afraid I may not be able to make it through this. I'm drying out as the night goes on. So coming off the tail end of a little cold, tested multiple times, just a cold. So, all right. So the strategic goals at the high school. Really, what we continue to do is explore the ways in which we can try to infuse the graduate profile in our day-to-day lives. We have a lot of these anecdotal small wins with different teachers kind of running down a particular road, but the system-wide change is something that we continue to sort of struggle with, and the place that we try to experiment is within the homeroom, and there are some things that in and of itself kind of present some challenges for us, and last year being one of those times. So we looked at COVID and the situation that we were in at the beginning of last year as an opportunity. We felt that after the spring of 2020, talking about mental health, we said, hey, let's really focus on care and student wellness and having them keep an eye on their own wellness and having our teachers work with them on that. Let's have them set some goals for this year because it's going to be a challenge to be here only half the time and virtual half the time. So let's have these kids set some goals and commit to their success. And then the last piece was around contribute and the idea that half of you are going to be in the room, half of you are not going to be in the room. How can you all contribute to making the success for everybody? And that was a big message that we pushed at the beginning of the year. And I think one of our successes was that we began the year with a really strong focus on that. Our homeroom, I remember very specifically with my kids, for the first 2 days, our homeroom to start the day, we had half the kids in the room, half the kids were online and on the TV. And then on that third day, we switched them. And we said, all right, so those of you that have been at home, what was that experience like? Those of you that have been here, what was that like? Now, how can we work together? And I remember a young man, Mason Rumar, stepped up, and he was really big into this. Dion Frick, those first few days, super helpful with each other and trying to make sure we're engaging all the students. So that we started the year with a really strong focus on that. The challenge became, as time went on, the idea of the wellness tracker, the idea of paying attention to your wellness, was something that became really kind of another thing that people had to do rather than a focal point for us. And so the enthusiasm around it kind of died out as the year went along. Believe it or not, high school kids don't really, focus all that much on their own wellness and care about tracking their wellness and paying attention to it. And so we got a lot of feedback around that. As the year kind of progressed, it became more of a chore than it was something that we felt was really positively impacting kids. The thing I want to also add on our successes, and you'll notice this is a pretty short list here. The other thing I want to point out is the idea that our teachers innovated tremendously over the course of the year, and they found new and better ways to do their business and to engage students in the learning process. And that can't be overlooked. It's not one of the graduate profile goals, but I don't want to overlook that. I think that's important. Opportunities for improvement, there were many. So one of the things we want to do this year is we want to revamp and then personalize the wellness tracker. For instance, one of the things we had them do was gather data over the first quarter and then set some goals for themselves, rather than try and set some goals for themselves in the first week of school when they don't really know what the year is going to look like anyway. So get them in the rhythm of it. So that was just one way that we did it. We also had them pare it down from many questions around like their screen time, how much sleep they got, what kind of exercise they got, what sort of coping strategies they're using. We wanted them to set a goal and then track only that goal and not have to track all the other things that we asked them to. They certainly could, but we wanted them to pare that down as they went into it. Our data collection process really frankly did not work well in the spring. We tried to use a Google form approach, have teachers fill in like, yes, these students did this, no, they didn't, and really kind of rely on the teachers to look at their the quality of what their goals were. But in the end, the data that we got was not very accurate. We ran into a lot of sort of misunderstandings around, am I supposed to be counting the number of kids that were here today or the total number of kids in my homeroom? There were some attendance concerns and some things along those lines. So we just ran into a lot of trouble. We're using Skyward, something that all the teachers are very familiar with, so they can actually gather data throughout the year. Anthony pointed that out. That's one of the things that we want to try and improve significantly this year. And then the last piece, the contribute kind of became a thematic piece to what we were doing in the sense of trying to contribute to the success of the whole and not just simply yourself. But we had to shut down all service learning projects last year, and so the idea of working towards that indicator got put on hold. We were hoping to gather baseline data last year, and ultimately we had to put a pause on that. And so as we go into this year, we're bringing back service learning opportunities. NHS is back out there. Key Club is back out there. Our social studies program, we're going to be able to gather all of our baseline data via Transio. A little bit of our progress. Again, contribute. We did not make progress on that because we had to put it on hold. Commit, we had some data gathering challenges with that, and again, it became a bit of a chore more so than something that kids were finding inspiration in. Ultimately, we were hoping to get 75% of the kids to have completed their goals and do a reflection at the end of the year. We were only able to reach 46% instead. For the care piece, again, we were hoping for 75% of the students filling out that wellness tracker, doing a reflection at the end of the year. We only reached 26%, so we did not hit the goals that we were hoping for. As far as CREATE is concerned, again, we were trying to implement the impact class as a sort of testing ground for having students work on a personalized project and making an impact within the larger community around them. And so that 3% is really representing the students in that class. One of the things we thought about, though, is if you've ever sat in on the Elements of Health and Medicine projects, the presentations those kids do, the research that they do, the desire to make an impact in the greater community around them is pretty extensive. And so we got to thinking, like, do we need to broaden our definition of what a CREATE project is? Students have choice in art, and they can choose to do different types of sculptures. Is that impactful enough, though? And so we started kind of talking about our definition. So we did some work with our building leadership team this summer to try and refine that definition so that we can gather a little bit better data this year, and we want to try and continue to expand on that impact course. Compete, that's all the data that Candace and Danielle shared with you, but ultimately about 85% of the class of 2021, which was a bit of a decline from the year prior, had met that compete goal with AP coursework, dual credit enrollment, industry certifications, and so on. It was kind of across the board where that decline happened, so it wasn't like we could say, well, there were less AP scores. We talked about the fact we expect that to decline and transition to dual enrollment. So I haven't quite deciphered that one just yet as to what the challenge is. And as far as connect every student having a mentor, 32% of the class 2021 had a mentor. One of the nice things about COVID is we've learned that we don't have to be limited by our geography. We can have a mentor anywhere in the world, frankly, because of all of our virtual connections that we make now. And so we're actually expanding our mentor list that way as well. So I wanted to get to the other highlights because while some of that was like, yeah, we didn't do a great job on the care and commit piece, we did some some other pretty cool things. We were open all last year. Like, we never closed. That was pretty cool. I was proud of our staff. I was proud of our student community in making sure that that happened. Throughout the course of that, we significantly exceeded expectations. So in a year when we could have said, we're not going to do great, or maybe we'll just do okay, and we're going to try and stay open, no, we actually excelled. I thought that was pretty powerful. We had 9 conference championships, multiple state appearances across multiple sports, and we ended up winning the boys state championship. So both in academics and in athletics, we provided our students opportunities all year long, despite all of the odds, and our students excelled. And I think that's really tremendous to say about our staff and about our students. We had some really cool innovations, from the personalization of our physical education program, which you guys have already heard about, to opening our school store, which you have already seen. And I wanted to, we've talked a little bit about the integrated math. Jean Bjork won a pretty cool award last year, the 2021 ISTE Arts and Technology Network Creativity Award. So taking some of her really great work that she does in her classroom, she is great about her professional learning network and sharing out and really trying to learn from that network. And so she is nationally regarded in the work that she does. And then the other piece that I wanted to point out, and you guys have seen it as well, is that PLE Garden Pergola project. And some of those really kind of emphasize that create piece and that contribute piece, and really giving back to our school community. So really great things happening. As we get into this year, getting back to normal is a big deal. We're trying to get our departments to be a little more adaptable and do it in a collective way. And so the PDSA and PPG structures are something that we are trying to build into our Friday mornings and getting them to collaborate in a more organic way. We're expanding the Insight courses. You've learned a little bit about that. The implementation of our improvements for Care and Commit, as we talked about, personalizing that to the students and doing a better job with that throughout the year, keeping it a priority. And then our work with WCTC to try and give students more credit or more access to dual enrollment options is really our expansion of our COMPETE, our graduate profile competency. What was that time? How'd I do, Rob? Doing all right? Okay. Steve?
Are you getting good receptivity with the leadership at WCTC for broadening our opportunities there?
Well, they actually kind of brought it up themselves. I think they see the really nice opportunity and alignment that exists, and so they had a meeting with multiple school districts around us. Was that in August, I want to say?
July or August, yeah.
Yeah. And so we went over, and they're looking to try and sort of clear the pathway and not have so many obstacles in front of kids as far as accessibility to these courses. And so it's exciting. We were kind of hoping it would be a little bit more of a collaborative process in the sense of designing courses and doing things in partnership. It's more like, let's give our kids more access directly to them, as opposed to some of that collaborative piece. But I think it's promising. It's great opportunities for our kids, for our students to be able to leave here with an associate's degree before they even graduate high school. I mean, I think that's when you talk about being competitive with other schools or students from other schools, that really is going to set them apart.
So we'll be bringing forward policy in December at the policy committee meeting, at the committee level, of the revision of policy to be able to be inclusive of then some of those expansions with WCTC. And so I just sent that to Julie today, in fact, so.
Do they drive a mechanism to bring the students right into their environment to explore what possibilities exist for that? Or how do they actively market that to drive that engagement from our students?
Well, I mean,
any students?
So through our counseling program, they work with individual students and say, here are some of the opportunities that have presented themselves to the students. The other piece has to do with some of our department leads. Our tech ed department, for instance, with two new people, they are focused this year on trying to build better relationships with WCTC so they can look at their own programming and make sure that they're in alignment. And it's like, hey, at this point you could just jump right to dual enrollment rather than saying you have to go all the way to here and then you could get to it, and not really knowing even what that looks like. They want to become well versed in that. So I think on multiple fronts, we are making sure that we're able to educate those students and they know what opportunities lay ahead for them. And that's part of that academic career planning process, is to be able to look at that 4-year map.
Yeah, so Adriana Plack and I sit on their career prep council committee, which meets monthly, or pretty close to monthly. And so we get a set of information, and then our counselors have like quarterly meetings with them as well, and they get that information. We get regular email contact information that they send, like we just got one today about a new dual enrollment program, and so then they send the flyer, they send all the information, so counselors, it's sort of turnkey for the counselors to be able to hand that over.
Thanks.
But I think, Steve, you're asking a really good question. And this has been one of those, like, it's a really a hot topic kind of thing out there in my mind. We are the closest school district in the whole probably state, next door to a technical college. And a lot of the stuff with the dual enrollment, whether it's the student that we had a few years ago who was this welder who had taken classes at the WCTC, who had finished his first year at WCTC and was able to go out and get a job working as a welder, and then within a year was able to finish his degree kind of thing. So I think that more we can do there, and the other part of it is the new president down there has been in Wisconsin before, but he came from Florida, and my sense is that he really wants to do some stuff. But I don't know if he's kind of like the driving of it, or if you're thinking about the collaborative. But somehow we got to connect him into this, because I think for a lot of our students, that's a really, really, really good route to take, because not everybody's designed or equipped to necessarily go into college right away, but they can get a lot of the credits that they would need if they want to go on for an advanced degree at some point. So I don't know how we could maybe kickstart that a little bit more.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do think it is kickstarted. You know, the WCTC president met with Mike and I this summer, and other schools as well. But through the Career Prep Council that Adriana and I go to regularly, that's where we're having those conversations. And, you know, from a dual enrollment standpoint, our percentage of students that we have, like, is one of the higher ones in the county because of that connection. So we don't offer as many transcripted courses because our kids can just go there. And so we have a higher percentage, a pretty high percentage of Start College Now, early college credit, and dual enrollment kids in comparison to other county districts. Again, our numbers are smaller because we're a smaller enrollment of, you know, our high school is the smallest in the county as well, or one of the smallest, right? So, but our percentage is high. So, you know, I do think we are right there on the front lines of those conversations and getting that out there and stuff. I think we'll be the first district that will have policy already changed and ready to go, because our policy was already pretty close. It doesn't need a lot of edits and stuff, where I think the other districts are still trying to figure out how they're going to do that.
Because one of the things out there in conversations with the Waukesha County Business Alliance, they have an educational policy committee. And that's one of the things. I mean, the employers in our community and surrounding community, I mean, they're desperate for people with the technical skills and background. So, I mean, I think we've got some really good synergies in terms of how we could make that happen, and maybe help forge some of those programs in combination with what we've learned, obviously, with our Insight program. But how can we apply some of those things in the more technical aspects of what goes on out there? Because for a lot of kids, it's a much better career fit for them in terms of where they go with it. And it's right next door kind of thing, so how do we do that? And then the other side note on this, and it's just because I met him at the, again, it was a Waukesha County Business Alliance. His wife is a graduate of Pewaukee High School. So, I mean, it's just like, talk about the small world connections out there, and I think that between combinations, they really understand how Pewaukee could be a leader, a real leader, in how do we develop this and deploy this in our community. So.
Yeah, and I think, you know, even just sort of paying attention to the idea that it's just as viable and even more in demand, and maybe very much more cost effective than a 4-year degree. I think so often we've talked about a 2-year degree as being somehow less than a 4-year degree. And, I think marketing from that standpoint is important too, and having kids understand the labor market. We've been going through our meetings with our seniors from our homeroom, and so I've really enjoyed that process. And part of that is talking about kind of a labor market analysis, so that they kind of think through what their next steps are just that much more. So.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I just want to thank you all for, I know that's a really long time, and thank you to our principals and to Candace and Robin for sticking it out tonight. I do want to just ask the board real quickly, so we could split this into 2 nights as well if we did the graduate profile minus compete, right? Compete has to stick with the data stuff because that's all the embargoed data, and we really can't do it until this time of year because it doesn't get unembargoed until so late. We could do all the other competencies of the graduate profile earlier because we have all of that done in July and stuff. Would the board prefer that we do split this between between 2 nights so that we could talk more about the graduate profile pieces? Or keep them so that you see all the interrelatedness of it all? Steve?
I have another option. Since our policy committee doesn't meet every month, why don't we just start the meeting an hour earlier?
That'll work too.
Okay.
That works too.
Yeah, I like that.
Okay. The audience seems to agree. Thank you.
Administrators, Candace, feel free to go home.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, all of you. Thank you.
Anthony, feel free to
Log off.
log off.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye, Anthony.
Bye.
Well, that moves us down to personnel issues. There's no resignations, appointments. Yeah, none. Under board goals and operations, I like to move to table item C, given the lateness of the hour, and bring that back on the 13th.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
How about a second?
I second that.
Yeah, can I just add one teeny comment to that? I don't know if it's come around yet or not, but the NSBA has selected a new executive director. I saw a memo that he put out, and I think that they got the message loud and clear. They need to kind of rethink some of their strategies and approaches, so.
Plus, our renewal is up in December as well.
Okay,
So,
yeah.
all right, we got a motion and a second. All in favor of tabling item C,
Yes.
say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? 7-0, okay. Review of upcoming activity. We do have school picture night on the 13th now. And you will be sans the beard? or-
Absolutely.
Okay,
So it
fantastic.
says.
No, it's gonna happen.
But you're almost to the point where you could play Santa Claus.
I know it.
We do have a learning session on the 6th of December.
Just a comment on that, Brian. I'm going to meet with John and Danielle based on what we want to cover in that session. We may be able to manage that in a board report at the December meeting. It may not require in our opinion, a full night learning session. So
Okay.
there's a potential we could cancel that.
All right, let us know. Then we go from the 13th, which we have both business affairs and policy, all the way to January 10th. If you guys get lonely, you can call each other.
But you can't do that, Brian. It's just-
Well, you don't have to talk
Family
about school
quorum,
stuff. Then the 17th, we are having that student education, and Candace will be back and talking about our board superintendent goal. And Julie, did everybody take the?
Everyone did.
Oh, right, no John Blaska's here, all right.
I fill his role really well, let's just say that.
You get the extra
Hey.
reminders.
All right.
Just in time.
February 14th, business fairs, and then we might have some Baldridge training going on the 24th, if anybody feels like they need to. It's during the day, unfortunately, so you're gonna have to get out of stuff, but Larry probably needs a refresher there.
Yes, I do.
So,
Can't get enough of it.
let's see, I think we can move down to legislative advocacy. The only thing that I know is going on is they did issue a report from one of the task force that Robin Voss put together. It was a subcommittee on education and economics, and it came out with a couple of broad themes there about increasing the number of teachers of color, improve early literacy for children of color, and funding for full-day 4-year-old kindergarten. So basically, there's a report out. I'm not sure what the process is at this point to do anything with it, but that was a report out.
No, thanks, Brent. I hadn't caught that. I don't have really anything else to add
Okay.
for legislative at this time.
All right. Then, with that, comments from citizens?
They have their coats on. I think they're.
wondering if Mike and I are getting a salute for staying
You really should.
Yes, you should. Yes.
Get the quad badge or something.
The gold star or the purple heart or whatever you want it to be.
Right on the
Yeah.
forehead.
So, all right. With that, I'll look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Amen.
7-0.
Amen.
Amen.